Welcome to Potter Read. Today's adventure. Harry found Ravenclaw's diadem at age 7 and its wisdom made him the smartest wizard alive. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Finding the diadem. Number 4. Privet Drive kept its secrets in the smallest spaces, and the smallest space in it belonged to Harry. The cupboard under the stairs was 4 feet by 3, a triangle where the staircase came down to meet the floor. A bare bulb hung on a frayed cord he was not allowed to leave on. A cot, a thin blanket, a row of his aunt's spare cleaning things, and Harry, who at 7 had learned to fold himself into corners the way other children learn to ride bicycles. When Dudley came thundering down the stairs in the mornings, the whole cupboard shook, and a fine gray dust sifted from the underside of the steps and settled on Harry's face, and he had taught himself not to sneeze. Sneezing meant being heard meant being remembered, and being remembered in this house was never a good thing. He had worked out a great many rules like that. They were not written anywhere. No one had sat him down and explained the laws by which he lived. He had assembled them the way a clever animal assembles the boundaries of its territory, by going too far once and not going there again. Do not ask for second helpings. Do not be cleverer than Dudley out loud. Do not let Aunt Petunia catch you reading, because reading was idleness, and idleness was a thing she punished with a list of chores as long as her arm. Do not ever let strange things happen near you, because strange things were your fault, and there was no defending yourself against a charge that was true. The strange things were the part Harry could not solve. They came when he was frightened or angry or, once, simply when he had wanted very badly to reach a jar of marmalade on a high shelf, and the jar had come down into his hands as if the air had carried it. He had stood holding it, heart going like a rabbit's, and he had understood 2 things at once, that he had done it and that he must never let anyone know he had done it. The marmalade had gone back on the shelf. Harry had eaten dry toast that morning and been glad of it, because dry toast did not get you locked in your cupboard for a week. There was a third kind of rule, the hardest of all, and it had to do with school. Harry had worked out very early that he was quicker than Dudley, quicker than most of the class, quick in a way that the teacher at the front of the room sometimes turned and looked at when he answered without being asked. He had worked out, just as early, that being looked at was dangerous everywhere, not only at home. The first time he had got every sum on the board correct, and the teacher had said, "Well done, Harry," in a surprised voice. Dudley had told Petunia, and Petunia had told Vernon, and Vernon had said a great many things about clever little boys who showed up their betters, and Harry had gone without supper and learned the lesson. After that, he made mistakes on purpose. He would get the first sum right and the third one wrong, on a schedule he kept in his head, so that he stayed in the comfortable gray middle of the class where no one's eye ever rested. It cost him something to do it. He could feel the right answer sitting in his hand and have to set it down and pick up a wrong one instead, like being made to hand a stranger your own coat. But a boy who could be ignored was a boy who was safe, and Harry had chosen safe, and he had got very good at 7 at the particular trick of being cleverer than he was allowed to seem. So he had a problem that no one would discuss, a mind that nobody wanted, and one place in all the world where both of those facts could be set down for a few hours like a heavy bag. The little winging public library was a low brick building 3 streets over, with a green door that stuck in wet weather and a smell of old paper and radiator dust that Harry had come to think of as the smell of being safe. He was not supposed to go there. The Dursleys did not forbid it in so many words, because to forbid it they would have had to think about him, and they preferred not to. They simply assumed that on a Saturday he was somewhere being a nuisance to someone else, and as long as he came home before Vernon did, the arrangement held. Miss Pelham ran the library. She was a tall, stooping woman with gray hair pinned up in a way that was always coming down, and an ink stain on the cuff of her right sleeve that never seemed to be the same stain twice. She had noticed Harry the first time he came in, a small boy in clothes 4 sizes too big, who went straight to the science shelves and read standing up because he did not feel he had the right to sit in one of the chairs. She had not asked him whose he was or where he lived or why his glasses were mended with tape. She had said, "If you push that stool over, you can reach the top row," and gone back to her cataloging, and in not asking she had given him the only gift anyone gave him in those years, which was to be left alone in a warm place with as many books as he could carry. He read the way starving people eat. He did not always understand what he read, and that was part of why he loved it. Understanding was a thing you chased, and the chase did not end, and as long as the chase did not end, he was never bored and never wholly alone. He read about glaciers and Roman roads and the insides of volcanoes. He read a child's encyclopedia from it to the middle of D before someone borrowed the volume that began with D, and he had been forced to skip ahead, which felt like skipping ahead in a story. He read about the planets and learned that the light from some stars was older than people, that when you looked up you were looking into the past, and he had stood in the small biography aisle that evening turning the idea over and over until it shone. That was the thing he could not have explained to anyone, least of all to the Dursleys, who treated a question as a kind of impertinence, that understanding a thing felt to Harry like being fed. He was hungry in the ordinary way too often, because the Dursleys measured his portions with the care of people rationing something they resented giving. But the other hunger was worse and better both, sharper and never quite cruel, and a single fact slotting into place, why the moon changed its shape, how a lever multiplied a small push into a large one, that the same word could hide two meanings and you had to choose between them, fed it as nothing on Petunia's table ever fed the first kind. He did not have the words for it at 7. He only knew that there was a place in him that wanted to know, that the wanting was the truest thing about him, and that the library was the only place that did not punish him for it. Once, when he had stood too long at the desk over an atlas that was too heavy to carry to a chair, Miss Pelham had looked at him over her spectacles and said, "You like the maps." It had not been a question, and Harry, who had learned that the safest answer to grown-ups was usually no answer at all, had nodded and waited to be told to put it back. Instead, she had turned the atlas around to face him and slid it an inch across the desk and gone back to her work, and let him stand there reading the names of rivers he would never see until the light failed. She had never once asked him a question he was afraid to answer. It was, he understood much later, a rarer kindness than it looked. On the Saturday that everything changed, he was reading about the brain. It was a fat book with a cracked spine and a drawing on the cover of a head sliced cleanly in half, the inside of it colored like a map. Harry had it open on his knees in the corner behind the periodicals, where the radiator ticked and no one came, and he was reading about how memory worked, or how the people who wrote the book thought it worked, which the book was honest enough to admit was not the same thing. He had got as far as a sentence that said the brain was the most complicated object in the known universe when the green door banged, and he heard Dudley's laugh. There was no mistaking that laugh. It came up from the belly and it had a wet edge to it, and it meant that Dudley had found something to enjoy, and the things Dudley enjoyed were almost always painful for someone smaller. Harry shut the book. Through the gap in the shelving he could see them, Dudley, pink and enormous in a new tracksuit, and Piers Polkiss with his rat's face, and two of the bigger boys from Dudley's class whose names Harry did not know but whose fists he did. They had come in out of boredom the way they came everywhere, and boredom in that group was a loaded thing looking for a target. "He's in here somewhere," Piers said. "I saw him come this way." Harry did the arithmetic without meaning to. There was one door and they were between him and it. The reading room had a fire exit, but it was alarmed, and an alarm would bring Miss Pelham, and Miss Pelham bringing trouble down on the Dursleys would be paid back on Harry's skin 100-fold once they got him home. There was the staff corridor behind the desk, which he was not allowed into, but which Miss Pelham sometimes left propped open when she was carrying boxes. He could not see the desk from where he sat. He would have to move and hope. He moved. He went on his hands and knees along the base of the shelving under the level of the books, where the carpet was worn to its threads, and he came out at the end of the aisle nearest the desk just as Dudley's heavy tread started down the far side. The desk was empty. The corridor door behind it stood ajar, a wedge of darker quiet beyond, and on the floor beside it sat a hand truck stacked with cardboard boxes that someone had been wheeling in and abandoned halfway. Harry slipped behind the desk, through the gap, and pulled the door to behind him until only a thread of light came through. He stood in the dark with his back against cool plaster and listened to his cousin not finding him. "He's not here," one of the bigger boys said after a while. "He's somewhere," Dudley said in the aggrieved tone of a boy who has been promised a treat and not been given it. "He always comes here. He thinks he's clever. Reading," said Piers, as if it were a disease. They drifted out. The green door banged a second time and the library settled back into its ticking quiet, and Harry let out a breath he had been holding so long it hurt. He should have gone back to the brain book. He should have waited 5 minutes and slipped out and gone home and been a good invisible boy. He knew that. He would think about it for years afterward, the small door of his life that had stood open just then and how he had not gone back through it. Instead, he turned around and looked at the room he had hidden in. It was a storeroom, narrow and deep, lined with metal shelving that held the library's overflow, boxes of withdrawn books, a broken globe, a stack of folding chairs with their canvas seats split. A single high window, gone amber with grime, let in the last of the afternoon. And along the near wall, where the hand truck's load had clearly come from, stood a dozen tea chests and cardboard boxes that did not look like the library's at all. They were old. The cardboard had the soft, furred look that cardboard gets when it has sat in a damp place for years, and someone had written on the sides of them in a spidery hand that the years had faded to the color of weak tea. Harry, who could not pass a written word without reading it, read, "Estate of a CREWE," said the nearest box, and under that smaller BOOKS, "Do not sell," and on the box beside it in the same hand, "Sundry, personal." He would learn the rest of that name later, and the woman it belonged to, and why a dozen boxes of a dead stranger's life had come to rest in the back room of a suburban library. For now it was only a name and a puzzle, and Harry loved a puzzle, and the boxes had not been forbidden to him because no one had imagined a boy small enough to be standing among them. He should not have opened anything. He knew that, too. but the box marked BOOKS had its flaps loose, and a book is not a thing a reader can leave shut, and he eased the top one back and looked in. They were not library books. They were old, bound in cloth and leather gone soft with age, and the titles on their spines, where there were titles, were in languages Harry did not know, and one or two in no alphabet he recognized at all. He lifted the topmost one. It was heavier than its size, the way the marmalade had been lighter than its size, and when he opened it, the pages were covered edge to edge in a small slanting hand, diagrams threaded through the writing, circles and stars, and what looked like the workings of a clock that told something other than time. On one page, a drawing of a plant he had never seen, its roots shaped almost like a screaming child, was labeled in a careful hand beneath a column of instructions he could not begin to parse. On another, a wand he knew the shape from picture books, a magician's wand, though no picture book he had read had ever treated it as a thing you might describe with measurements, was sketched in cross-section, with arrows and numbers and a notation about something called a core. He turned back to the screaming root and forward to the wand, and felt the floor of the ordinary world tilt very slightly under him. These were not storybooks pretending. Whoever had written them had meant every word, and had expected to be believed, and had been writing for readers who already knew that a magician's wand was a real object with a real inside. He could not read a single word of it. He sat down on the cold floor anyway and turned the pages, because a thing you cannot read is the best kind of thing there is, a locked door with the promise of a room behind it, and he was so absorbed in the not reading that several minutes passed before he became aware that the room had a feeling in it. He could not have said what the feeling was. Later, when he had words for everything, he would still not have a good word for that. It was the sensation of being looked at by something that had no eyes. It came from the box marked sundry, and it was not unfriendly, and it was not friendly either. It was the particular attention of a thing that has been waiting a long time and has just noticed that the waiting might be over. Harry put down the book and went to the box and opened it. Inside, wrapped in a moth-eaten shawl, were the leavings of a life, a pair of spectacles in a steel case, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, a pocket watch that had stopped. A tarnished spoon, a thimble, a child's chipped teacup with a rabbit painted on it, faded almost to nothing. And under all of it, at the very bottom, a hatbox round, the lid gone soft, the once bright stripes worn to suggestions of color. The feeling came from the hatbox. Harry lifted it out and set it on his knees and took off the lid. There was a tiara inside. That was what his eye told him first, what anyone's eye would have told them. A lady's tiara, the sort of thing you saw in films about kings, a band of silver to go around the head with a swept-up shape at the front like the spread wings of a bird, and a single blue stone set at the center where the wings met. It was the kind of thing that turned up at jumble sales by the dozen, costume pieces, paste and plate, worth nothing. He could see why the people who had sorted Miss Crewe's life into boxes had tossed it in with the spoons and the thimble. Costume jewelry, sundry, personal. He could see why they had not looked twice, but Harry was looking, and the longer he looked the less the first story held. The silver was not tarnished. Everything else in the box had gone dull with the years, the spoon black, the watch case clouded, and the silver of the tiara was bright as water, bright as the moment it was made, and it did not gather the grime of the room the way the window had. The blue stone was not glass. Glass has a flatness to it even when it shines. This had a depth, and the depth moved very slowly, the way the bottom of a clear stream moves when you have stared at it long enough to see the current. And around the inside of the band, where it would touch the brow of whoever wore it, there were words. They were cut into the metal in a flowing script, and although the script was strange and the language stranger, Harry found, and this was the first wrong thing, the first impossible thing, though he would not understand how impossible until much later, that he could read them. Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure. He read it twice. The words went into him and sat there, plain and complete, as though they had always been somewhere in him, and the silver had only reminded him. He did not know that they were not in English. He did not know that the letters his eye was tracing belonged to no alphabet taught in any school on earth. He only knew that he had read them, and that reading them had felt less like learning a new thing than like remembering an old one. He made himself stop and think, because thinking was the thing he did when he was frightened, the one tool he trusted. He laid the facts out in a row the way the brain book had said scientists did. The silver had not aged when everything around it had. That was one fact, and it was not a fact that paste and plate could explain. The stone had a depth that moved, too. He had read words in a script he had never seen, and read them as easily as breathing. 3, and 3 was the one that would not lie down. A boy could be wrong about silver. A boy could imagine a current in a blue stone if he stared long enough. But a boy could not read a language he had never learned, and Harry had read it, and the reading had felt like memory, and there was no honest place to put that fact except the place he had spent his whole life refusing to look, the place where the marmalade jar floated down out of the air into his waiting hands. The strange things, the things that were his fault. He understood, sitting on the cold floor with the bright silver on his knees, that he had found a strange thing that belonged to him as the marmalade had belonged to him, and that it was, perhaps, the first one that had ever wanted to be found. The amber light from the high window had gone to the color of an old penny. Somewhere beyond the door, the library breathed its dusty quiet. Harry sat with the open hat-box on his knees and the bright silver in it, and he was aware, in a wordless 7-year-old way, that he had come to a kind of edge. He did not put it on. He wanted to. The wanting was enormous, larger than any wanting he had felt about food or warmth or being left alone, and it frightened him, because Harry had survived 7 years in that house precisely by never wanting anything so much that he could not let it go. A boy who wants nothing cannot be punished by having things taken away. He had made himself into that boy on purpose, brick by brick, and now here was a thing pulling at him hard enough to crack the wall, and the part of him that had built the wall said, very quietly, not here. Not now, not where anyone could come through that door and see your face change, because he knew his face would change. He did not know how he knew. He looked at the silver and he understood, the way you understand a drop before you take a step in the dark, that putting it on would not be a small thing, and that whatever happened when he did, he wanted it to happen where no one in the world could see. He put the lid back on the hat box. His hands were not quite steady. He took the brain book. He was not leaving the brain book, and he took the hat box, and he stood in the dim storeroom working out, with the cold practical part of his mind that never entirely switched off, how to get a hat box the size of a football out of a library and 3 streets home without being seen. The answer was the canvas bag Miss Pelham kept by the door for returns, the one she let regular borrowers use. He would have to take it and bring it back. Taking was stealing, and stealing was a thing that got found out, and getting found out was the worst thing of all. He stood and waited, and for the first time in his life the weighing came out on the side of the risk. He eased the corridor door open. The library was empty, gold with the last light, Miss Pelham nowhere in sight, gone, he guessed, to the little back kitchen where she made her tea at closing. He took the canvas bag from its hook. He put the hat box in it and the brain book on top, and he carried it to the desk and stood there a moment, because there was a thing he had to do that he had never done before, which was to leave a record of himself. There was a stub of pencil on the desk and a pad of the slips borrowers used to reserve books. Harry wrote in his careful small hand, "Borrowed the bag, will bring it back, the book about the brain too." He did not write his full name. He had a sense already that the fewer marks he left, the better. He left the slip where she would find it, and he let himself out through the green door into the blue evening, and the door stuck the way it always did, and then gave the way it always did, and he was outside with a dead woman's silver in a borrowed bag, and his heart going like the wings of something trying to get out of a box. The street lights had come on while he was inside, the orange sodium kind that turned everything the color of a bruise. Harry walked the 3 streets home through that orange dark with the bag held against his chest in both arms, and he had never in his life been so aware of being a small boy alone on a road. Every car that passed slowed him to a guilty crawl. Every lit window was a pair of eyes. He took the long way down Wisteria Walk where the houses sat back behind their hedges, because the long way had fewer people on it, and he passed the house where the old woman with all the cats lived, the one Aunt Petunia sometimes left him with when she could find no other arrangement, and a tabby sitting on the gate-post turned its head and watched him go by with the flat yellow attention of something that knew more than it would say. Harry held the bag tighter and walked faster and told himself he was being stupid and did not slow down until the cat was 3 gardens behind him. He was used to being looked at by people. He was not used to being looked at by the world, and the silver in the bag had begun, he thought, to make the world look back. He did the sums as he walked, because the sums were a railing to hold. Vernon left the office at 6:30 on a Saturday and made the drive in about 40 minutes when the ring road was kind. It had been 6:45 by the library clock when he left. He had perhaps 10 minutes grace, perhaps 15, to be inside the house and invisible before the car turned into the drive, and 10 minutes was enough if he did not stop, and he did not stop. He cut through the gap in the fence at the end of Magnolia Crescent that the bigger boys used, and across the strip of dead grass behind the gardens, and he came to the back of number 4 from the alley, where the kitchen light was on, and Petunia's shape moved behind the net curtain, and he stood in the dark of the alley getting his breath and his face back under control before he went in. 600 miles to the north, in a city built of gray stone where it had begun to rain, a man named Mortlake learned that a Delphine crew was dead. He learned it the way he learned most things, which was sideways and for money. The notice came folded inside another notice, in the cramped back pages of a publication that did not have a name printed anywhere on it and was not sold in any shop, among the death announcements that the wizarding world placed for its own, and that a certain kind of reader knew how to read. CREWE, a Delphine, of no fixed parish, peacefully, at a great age. 4 words of fact and a great deal of silence around them, and to almost everyone who saw it the name meant nothing, an old woman gone, the world a little emptier and no different. To Mortlake it meant that a door he had been watching for 19 years had finally come unlatched. He sat in the window of a coffee house that catered to people who did not wish to be remembered, and he read the 4 words again, and his face did not change, because his face had been trained out of changing a long time ago. He was a narrow man of indeterminate middle age, dressed in the kind of good gray clothes the eye slides off, and the only remarkable thing about him, if you got close enough to notice, which few people did and fewer survived doing twice, was his stillness. He had the stillness of a heron. Things that are very good at waiting have it. He had waited 19 years for the crew woman to die, because the living are protected by laws and habits and the attention of their neighbors, and the dead are protected by nothing but the speed of whoever gets there first. He took out a notebook bound in black and uncapped a pen and wrote, in a hand as small and even as printed type, a list. Cottage, solicitor, heirs none presumed, effects where, he underlined the last, the effects were the only part that mattered. The Delphine crew had owned, somewhere among the ordinary clutter of a very long and very quiet life, an object that a great many people across a great many years had believed lost, and that one person living was prepared to pay a fortune to be told was not. Mortlake did not care what the object was. He had been a finder of lost things for 30 years, and the first thing he had taught himself was not to care what the thing was, because caring was a kind of wanting, and wanting made you slow. He had found a stolen child once, and a stolen wand, and a stolen heart in a stolen jar, and he had felt the same nothing handing each of them over for payment. He was being paid this time by a man he had met exactly once in a dim house full of clocks. The house had been full of clocks. That was the detail his trade had taught him to keep. Hundreds of them on every wall and shelf, all running, all telling slightly different times, so that the room was never silent and never agreed with itself. The client had sat among them in a high chair like a throne, an old man named Holloway, who had once, Mortlake gathered, been a name to reckon within the narrow world that placed its death notices in pages with no titles. Holloway had not said what the crew object was. He had said only that it had been taken from its proper line by an accident of inheritance generations ago, that it was his by right he did not trouble to explain, and that he would pay whatever a man cared to name to hold it before he died. And then, while he was saying it, he had stopped dead in the middle of a word, his mouth open, his eyes gone suddenly empty, a man who had walked into a room in his own mind and found the door behind him closed. It had lasted only a moment. He had come back and gone on as though nothing had happened, and pretended with the brittle dignity of the very proud that Mortlake had not seen. But Mortlake had seen, and he had understood why a man surrounds himself with hundreds of clocks all running at once. It was so that wherever he turned he would always be able to find the time, in case the part of him that knew it had gone out again. The man wanted the crew object more than Mortlake had ever seen anyone want anything. That was the client's affair. Mortlake's affair was to find it, and finding things was the one art in the world he had ever loved. He closed the notebook. Outside, the rain came down on the gray city, and somewhere far to the south a thread had been pulled, and he could feel it, the way a spider feels a thread, the first tremor running up a line he had strung and tended for 19 patient years. He left money on the table and went out into the rain to begin. Harry came in through the back door of number 4 at 7:20, which was 11 minutes before Vernon's car turned into the drive, and the 11 minutes were the difference between an ordinary evening and a catastrophe, and he had spent them well. The house was loud with the television, and the smell of the dinner Petunia was keeping warm. Dudley was in the front room with his face 6 inches from the screen. Petunia was at the stove with her back to the hall. Harry went past the kitchen door in the soundless gliding walk he had perfected, heel down soft, weight rolled forward, never a creak, and he reached the cupboard under the stairs and let himself in and pulled the door to, and he sat in the dark with the canvas bag clutched to his chest and listened to his uncle come home. The car door, the front door. Vernon's voice, big and pleased with itself, telling Petunia about his day at the drill company as though the drills had personally distinguished themselves. The clink of cutlery. Nobody said Harry's name, which was the thing he listened for, the absence that meant safety. They had not noticed he was late. They had not noticed him at all. He was, for the moment, exactly as invisible as he had spent his whole life learning to be, and behind the invisibility, in the dark of the cupboard, he had a thing that had read him back. He waited until the sounds of the house had settled into their evening shapes, the television, the low rumble of Vernon, the clatter of Petunia clearing up. Then, by the thin light that came under the door, Harry took the hat box out of the bag. There was a place in the cupboard he had made his own. Behind the cot, where the underside of the stairs came down lowest, a section of the skirting board had come loose, and the space behind it ran back into the dark under the bottom step, dry and dusty and entirely his. He kept things there, a marble, a blue bird's feather, a photograph he was not supposed to have of 2 people laughing, who Aunt Petunia said in a tight voice were nobody when he had once asked. The hat box would not fit, but the tiara would. He lifted it out, the silver cool and bright even in the dark, the one bright thing in the whole black cupboard, and wrapped it in the moth-eaten shawl and slid it into the space behind the skirting board, and fitted the board back, and sat looking at the place where it was hidden as though he could see through the wood. He could have left it there. He thought about leaving it there. He was good at leaving things, at not wanting, at the patient discipline of the boy with no wants, and a wiser and more frightened part of him said that the safe thing, the survivable thing, was to leave the silver behind the board until he understood what it was. But he had carried it 3 streets in the dark and risked everything he had to do it, and the wanting had not gone away. The wanting had grown. It sat in him now like a held breath, and he understood that he was not going to be able to sleep or eat or read or live until he had answered the one question that had stood at the center of him since the moment in the storeroom when the silver had read its own words into his mind. What happens when I put it on? He listened to the house. Petunia's footsteps went up the stairs. Vernon's followed, heavier. Dudley's heaviest of all, the boards groaning, the dust sifting down onto Harry's upturned face, and he did not flinch and he did not sneeze. A door closed, another. The television clicked off. The house breathed out and went quiet, the deep settled quiet of a family asleep, and Harry sat alone in his cupboard in the dark in the silence with his heart going and going. He let an hour go by. He counted it more or less by the small noises a house makes settling for the night, the tick of the cooling pipes, the click of the fridge cycling on and off, once a car somewhere out on the crescent. He had learned to be patient the way he had learned everything by the cost of failing at it, and he made himself wait until he was certain that no foot would come down the stairs, that no one would wrench the cupboard door open and find him doing whatever it was he was about to do. The waiting did not cool the wanting. If anything, it banked the wanting hotter, the way holding your breath makes the next one larger. He sat with his knees drawn up and his back against the cool plaster and his hand resting flat on the loose board behind which the silver lay, and he thought for no reason he could name of the 2 laughing people in the photograph he was not allowed to have, and of how no one in the world knew where he was at that moment or would think to wonder, and of how that fact, which had always been a wound, was tonight for the first time also a kind of freedom. There was no one to forbid him. There never. He had simply never before had anything worth doing with the long, unwatched hours of his own small life. He reached behind the skirting board and drew the silver out into his hands. In the dark it had its own faint light, or seemed to, a coolness on the eye like the moon on water. The words ran around the inside of the band where they would lie against his brow. Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure. He did not know yet whose words they were, or how old, or what a great and lonely mind had poured into the making of the thing he held, or that across the country a still man in good gray clothes had already begun patiently to walk toward him along a thread 19 years in the laying. He knew none of it. He was 7 years old and unwanted and clever past his years, and starving for the one thing the world had refused him, which was to understand. He lifted the silver to his head. The band was cold, it touched his hair and then his brow, and the cut words came to rest against his skin, and for one instant, one held, hanging, ordinary instant, nothing happened at all, and Harry sat in the dark of the cupboard under the stairs at number 4 Privet Drive, an unremarkable boy with a piece of old silver on his head, on the very last edge of the life he had been living. Then the instant ended, and the world opened like an eye. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, The Wisdom Awakens. It did not feel like magic. That was the thing Harry would never be able to make anyone understand in all the years that came after, because everyone assumed that wearing such a thing must feel like a flood pouring in, a voice, a fire, a power seizing you by the back of the neck. It was not like that. It was the opposite of that. It felt like a window opening in a room he had lived in all his life without knowing it had a window, and the air that came through was simply clear. The dark of the cupboard was still there. The cot, the dust, the loose board, his own crossed legs, all there, unchanged, but the dark had structure now. He could feel the cupboard around him as a shape his mind held complete. The slope of the stairs overhead, 4 feet 7 inches at the high end and falling to nothing, the angle of it precise as a drawing. The door 3 feet to his left and the hairline of light beneath it, the air brick low in the outer wall through which a thread of night came in cold. He had lived in this cupboard for as long as he could remember and never once held it whole in his head like that, all of it at once, every dimension known. Now he did without trying, the way you know where your own hand is in the dark, and it did not stop at the walls of the cupboard. His own thoughts had become a thing he could watch. This was the strangest part, stranger than the silver, stranger than the script he had read. All his life Harry had thought the way everyone thinks, which is to say he had thoughts and did not see them coming. They simply arrived and he was their passenger. Now he could see the machinery. He thought of the brain book, and the page he had read that afternoon rose in front of his mind's eye entire. Not the gist of it, not the memory of having read it, but the page, the cracked photograph of the sliced head, the exact sentence about the most complicated object in the known universe, the smudge of someone's thumbprint in the lower margin. He had read it once, hours ago, glancing. It was simply there now, kept the way a word you have just spoken is still in the air. He turned his attention to the page before it, and that was there too. He went back through the whole afternoon, and it unrolled for him perfect and ordered, every box in the storeroom, every faded letter on every label, and he understood with a slow, cold thrill that he was not remembering. He was reading a record that had been kept without his asking, and the record went back. He reached, carefully, the way you put a foot onto ice, The record went back and back, to the marmalade, to the first cupboard morning he could find, to things before that, to a green light and a high cold laugh that he flinched away from, and did not look at, not yet, not tonight. He understood that he could have looked. The understanding frightened him more than anything else, because it told him the size of the thing on his head. Whatever this was, it had not given him a new mind. It had given him the use of the one he already had, the whole of it, the parts that had always been doing their work in the dark behind the little lit window where he lived. Wit beyond measure. He had thought it was a poem. It was a description. He sat very still and let it teach him what it was, and it taught him not by speaking. It never spoke, not once in all the years. That was the second thing no one believed, but by being a clarity into which his own questions fell and came back answered, as a struck bell comes back with a note. There was no voice. There was no other person in his head, no ghost of the woman who had made it, no whispering will bending him to purpose. There was only understanding, vast and patient and his, an enormous quiet room of it that he had been given the key to, and the things stored in that room were not facts so much as ways. Ways of seeing, ways of holding a problem so that it seems showed, ways of learning which were the most valuable things in the room, because a way of learning is a key that fits every lock there will ever be. He could feel them ranged around him in the clear dark, methods and disciplines and habits of attention laid down by, he did not know by whom, not that night, laid down by someone who had spent a long life thinking about thinking, and had found a way to keep what she learned past the death of the mind that learned it. The silver did not make him her. It made him the best possible version of himself, and then it stood at his shoulder and showed him how to think. How long he sat there he could not afterward say, even with perfect memory, because time itself had gone strange and bright. The fridge cycled on and off, the pipes ticked. At some point he became aware that his neck was stiff and his legs had gone to sleep beneath him, ordinary small complaints of an ordinary small body, and the contrast of them, the pins and needles in his foot against the cathedral in his head, made him do a thing he had not done in a long while, which was to laugh once very quietly with his hand over his mouth. Then he took it off. He did it carefully, lifting the band away from his brow with both hands, the way you lift a sleeping thing you do not want awake, and the moment the cut words left his skin, the window closed. It was not a slamming shut. It was a fading, a tide going out, and Harry sat in the dark and felt the great clear room recede from him, and the walls of his ordinary mind draw back in around the little lit place where he had always lived, and he was, for a few terrible seconds, only Harry again, a small cold boy in a cupboard, and the loss of it was so enormous that he nearly put it straight back on. He did not. He made himself sit with the loss and study it, because studying things was what he did, and because he could feel, and this was the discovery that mattered more than any other that night, that the tide had not gone all the way out. It had left things on the shore. The page from the brain book was still there, not as sharp, he could not read the thumbprint now, but it was there, the sense of it, the shape of the argument, far clearer than anything he had ever held the morning after reading. More than the page, the way of holding it was still there. When he turned his attention to the cupboard, he found he could still feel some of its shape, dimmer, a sketch instead of a drawing, but his. The silver gave him the whole room. When he took the silver off, he kept what he had carried out of it. He sat in the dark and worked through what that meant, and his small, ordinary heart began to beat very fast, because what it meant was that this was not a crown he would have to wear forever to be more than he was. It was a teacher. It would show him a thing entire, and he would walk away from it carrying as much of that thing as a boy could carry, and the next time he wore it he would start from where he had left off, and the carrying would grow. He was not going to be a clever puppet of a piece of silver. He was going to be taught, lesson upon lesson, by the patient ghost of a method, until the lessons were his own, and the silver only deepened what he had already made of himself. Do not nerf yourself, said the cold, clear part of him that the silver had woken and that would never entirely sleep again. Whatever this is, it is the best thing that has ever happened to you, and the worst mistake you could make would be to need it. He wrapped the diadem in the shawl and put it back behind the board, and he lay down on the cot in the dark, and he did not sleep, but it was not the wakefulness of misery he was used to. It was the wakefulness of a mind that has too much to do to bother with sleeping. He spent the rest of that night, the first night, doing the simplest and most important thing the silver had taught him without meaning to, which was to think clearly about his own situation, on purpose, all the way to the end. He was a wizard. He let himself say it in the dark, in the privacy of a skull no one had ever cared to look inside. The strange things had never been accidents and had never been his fault in the way the Dursleys meant. They had been the ordinary leaks of a power he had been born with and never taught to hold. The marmalade, the teacher's wig turning blue that time, which he had never been able to explain and had been beaten for anyway. The roof of the school kitchens, when Dudley's gang had chased him and he had wished himself away and found himself, impossibly, on the roof. All of it the same thing, the same hymn, leaking. There were books written in a language he could read and could not read, books that described a magician's wand the way the brain book described a brain, books that had come to him in a dead woman's boxes, along with a tiara that was not costume jewelry and had been waiting, the feeling had told him, to be found. There was a world behind the world. He had always half believed it, the way every lonely clever child half believes it, and the difference between Harry and every other lonely clever child was that he had been right, and had the proof of it hidden behind a loose board 8 inches from his head. And then, having let himself feel the wonder of it all the way down, he did the thing that would keep him alive, which was to turn the wonder off and think about danger instead. Because if there was a world behind the world, then there were people in it. People who made tiaras that taught, and people who lost them, and the cold part of him followed the line without flinching people who would want them. A thing this valuable had not simply been dropped. It had been hidden carefully for a long time in the dull camouflage of a spinster's bric-a-brac. Someone had wanted it not to be found, which meant someone else had wanted to find it. He did not know who, or where, or how close. He knew only the shape of the logic, and the shape of the logic said, "The most powerful thing you have ever touched is also the most dangerous thing you have ever touched, and the danger is not in the silver. The danger is in everyone who will want it once they know a child has it, so no one would know." He set the rule that night, lying in the dark, and he set it the way the silver had taught him to set things, completely, without the soft exceptions a frightened person leaves themselves. Not the Dursleys who would take it and sell it or smash it, not the children at school, not Miss Pelham however kind, because kindness was not safety, and a kind person who knew a dangerous secret was simply a danger who meant well, not anyone. He would wear the silver only in the dark, only alone, only behind a locked as it got cupboard door, and he would carry out of it only what could be carried in a head that had to pass every single day, as the head of a dull and beaten boy who got the third sum wrong on purpose. The brightness would live inside him. The outside of him would stay exactly, carefully, the dim gray shape the world already ignored. He had spent 7 years learning to be overlooked. He saw now that he had been training all that time for precisely this, and the cruelty that had taught him invisibility had handed him, without meaning to, the one skill that would let him keep the greatest thing he would ever own. He almost smiled at that in the dark. He did not quite. Smiling even alone was a habit, and habits leaked. Far to the north the rain had stopped, and Mortlake stood in the cold of a cleared-out cottage and read the absence of a woman the way other men read a page. The cottage was on the edge of nowhere, a low stone thing crouched against a hill with the sea of gray rumor beyond it, and it had been thoroughly and recently emptied. That told him things. He moved through the rooms without haste, his hands in his pockets, touching nothing, and let the place speak. There were pale rectangles on the faded walls where pictures had hung for decades and been taken down in a week. There were the ghost prints of furniture in the dust of the floorboards, and the dust itself was wrong, disturbed in the broad, careless swathes of people carrying boxes, not the narrow tracks of a person living. A solicitor's clearance, efficient, indifferent, paid by the hour. They had come in and taken a long, quiet life and packed it into cartons and carried it away to be turned into money. And they had not known, because how could they, that one of the cartons held a thing that several of the men Mortlake had worked for would have burned the cottage and everyone in it to possess. He stood in what had been the woman's study, a small room with one window facing the sea, and here he stopped, because here the emptiness had a different quality. The clearance men had stripped the shelves. But the shelves themselves told him what had stood on them, deep shelves built for large books and reinforced. He crouched and looked at the brackets, reinforced far beyond what any ordinary book required. The brackets of a woman who had owned volumes that were heavier than their size. He knew that weight. He had carried such books himself in his trade and broken his back on more than one. So, she had been what the death notice's silence had implied. Not a witch openly, there was no trace of true working in the house. No scorch of it, no residue his trained sense could catch, but of the world deep in it, a keeper of its old heavy books, living out 100 quiet muggle years on the edge of the sea with something precious in her bric-a-brac and a wand, if she had ever owned one, long since given up or buried with whoever came before her. A guardian, then. The word arrived in his cold mind, and he let it stand, not the owner of the thing. Last, by the look of the house, of a line of keepers, dying alone with no one to hand the duty to, which was exactly the kind of accident his client was paying him to exploit. A line that guards a thing for centuries and then simply runs out like a candle, and the thing it guarded rolls out into the indifferent world in a cardboard box marked sundry and is gone unless someone is watching. Mortlake had been watching for 19 years. He felt no triumph. Triumph, like wanting, made you slow. He found the solicitor's name on a single overlooked envelope behind the study door, slid half under the skirting, and he copied it into the black notebook in his small, even hand, and beneath it he wrote one word underlined, where. The effects had gone somewhere. To an auction house, to a charity, to a dealer, dispersed into the great moving river of second-hand things that flowed through the country every day, and somewhere in that river was a hat box, and in the hat box a thing that had not been seen by a knowing eye in 300 years. He would find the solicitor, and the solicitor would tell him where the boxes had gone. They always told him in the end, the soft muggle men of business. A little memory adjusted, a little fear applied where charm did not suffice, and the boxes would tell him the next thing, and the next, and the river would narrow to a stream, and the stream to a single drop, and at the bottom of it would be the object, and he would be paid. He took one last look at the small room with its window on the gray sea, the room where a woman had sat for 100 years guarding a secret that had outlived her, and he felt the nearest thing his trade allowed him to a professional respect. She had kept it safe a long time. It was not her fault she had died. It was only the way of things that the patient lose in the end to the patient, and he had been patient longer. He went out and pulled the cottage door shut behind him, and the latch fell with a small final sound, and Mortlake walked down the hill toward the place where he could leave, already composing in his mind the few quiet questions that would empty a country solicitor of everything he knew. The hardest part in those first days was the daylight. The nights were his, but the days belonged to the Dursleys, and Harry discovered at once that the thing the silver had woken in him did not switch off when he took the silver off. It only dimmed. The great clear room receded, but its windows stayed open a crack, and through the crack came a steady draft of seeing that he had to spend every waking hour pretending not to feel. He sat at the breakfast table on the morning after the moth and watched Vernon eat, and he could not stop himself reading the man, the small tells of a bully's mood, the way the jaw worked, the way the eyes went to the Morning Post and the gas bill and darkened, the whole weather of the house written plain on 3 sleeping faces, and he understood that he had always read them, a little the way prey reads a predator, and that now he read them completely, and that this was the most dangerous gift of all. Because a boy who understands the people around him too well is a boy who slips, who answers the question they have not yet asked, who flinches a half-second before the blow because he saw it being decided. So he practiced being slow. It was the strangest discipline of his life, harder than holding the cupboard hole in his mind, harder than reading the dead script, to know a thing and let his face arrive at not knowing it on a delay, like a boy who was only ordinarily afraid. When Petunia snapped at him to fetch the marmalade of all things, he made his hand reach up clumsily and knocked the jar so it nearly fell, and caught it badly and set it down, and was rewarded with the contempt that was the safest currency in that house. A clever catch would have been remembered. A clumsy one was invisible. He was learning to spend his competence the way a hunted animal spends its scent, carefully, leaving as little of it on the air as he could manage. Dudley was easier because Dudley required nothing but a target, and Harry had been a target for years and knew the part. When the gang cornered him by the garages after school on Tuesday, Harry understood, with the silver's residue cold and clear in him, exactly how to slide out of it. 3 things he could say that would turn Piers against Dudley, a way to put the low wall between himself and the heaviest of them, a feint that would buy the 4 seconds he needed to be gone. He used none of it. He let them have the shove and the dead arm and the laughter, and he ran the way a frightened boy runs, badly, and fell the way a frightened boy falls, and gave them the afternoon's small ugly pleasure at the price of a bruise, because a Harry who escaped cleverly was a Harry they would start to wonder about, and a Harry they wondered about was a Harry who was finished. The bruise was nothing. He had been collecting bruises his whole life. What he could not afford to collect was attention. School was the finest needle to thread. The silver had not made him learned. He still did not know what he had not read, but it had made him quick past any disguising, and quickness was exactly the thing a classroom was built to notice. The teacher set the class a page of sums on the Wednesday morning, the kind Harry could now do before his pencil touched the paper. The answers simply present the way the page of the brain book was present, and he sat and looked at them and felt the old cost rise in his throat, the cost of handing a stranger his own coat. He did the sums wrong, not all of them. That drew its own kind of eye. He did them the way a middling boy did them, 3 right and 1 careless, a 4 turned to a 9, a column added in haste, and he handed the page in smudged and unremarkable, and watched the teacher's pen pass over it without pausing, and felt the relief of a man who has walked past a guard with contraband under his coat. It should have felt like a small triumph. It felt instead like a small death, one of many he would die in that gray room over the years, the daily quiet killing of the thing he actually was so that the thing he pretended to be could go on living. He told himself it was worth it. He was, increasingly, a boy who could tell himself things and be believed. What he had not expected was how lonely the mask would make him, and how fast. He had been lonely all his life, but it had been the simple loneliness of a child no one wanted, and there was a floor to it. You could not fall further than unloved. This was a new floor, and it had a trapdoor. Now there was a whole bright country inside him, the clearest and most wonderful thing that had ever happened to a person, and there was not one soul on the earth he could show it to. Miss Pelham came nearest, and Miss Pelham he had ruled out on the first night, coldly, correctly, because a kind person who knew his secret was a danger who meant well. He would carry the country alone. He understood, sitting in the gray classroom with a deliberately ruined page of sums in front of him, that this was the true price of the silver, larger than the headaches and the shaking hands, that to be the smartest person in every room he would ever stand in, and to let no one ever know it, was to be, in a way the Dursleys had never quite managed to make him, completely and permanently alone. He looked at the price. He did not flinch from it. He had wanted to understand more than he had wanted anything, more than he had wanted to be loved if he was honest, and the silver had not lied to him. Wit beyond measure was a treasure, and like every treasure worth the name, it had to be kept in the dark and guarded and never ever shown. He decided he could bear it. He was 7, and he had already borne worse for less. It took Harry 4 days to find a way back to the library, and he spent the 4 days being more careful than he had ever been about anything. He wore the silver each of those nights, once the house was deep in sleep, and each night the great clear room opened for him, and each morning he carried a little more of it out. He learned the discipline of it the way he learned everything, by paying attention to the cost. He found that if he wore it too long his ordinary body suffered for it, his eyes ached, his hands shook a little the next day, the way they might after a fever, because the brightness asked things of a brain that was, after all, a 7-year-old's, gray and soft and growing. So he rationed himself. An hour, perhaps 2, no more, and he used the hours not to gorge but to study, choosing each night one thing to understand completely and carry away. The first night he chose the cupboard, and learned to hold a space hole in his mind. Second, he chose his own past, and went a little further back along the kept record than he had dared the first time, and came at last on purpose, with the silver's clear method to steady him, to the green light, and looked at it, and understood that he was looking at the night his parents died, and that they had not died in a car crash, whatever Aunt Petunia said, because there was no car in the memory. There was only the green light and the cold laugh and a woman's voice saying, not Harry, please." And he took the silver off after that and lay in the dark and was a small grieving boy for a while, which the silver permitted, because the silver permitted everything. It only ever made him more himself, and that night what he was a child who had just learned how his mother sounded when she died for him. The third night he chose something easier on purpose, because even a method has to know when to rest. He chose language. He took out the one book from the crew boxes he had managed to carry home along with the hat box. He had taken only one, the smallest, slipped into his shirt, because a boy can be searched and a bulge explained, but a single thin book against the belly is invisible, and he opened it under the silver's clarity, and the script that had been a wall became a door. It was not English. He understood with the silver on that it had never been English, that what he was doing when he read it was not translation but something stranger and more total. A direct apprehension of the meaning the marks were made to carry, as though the writer's intention reached across the centuries and laid itself directly into his understanding. The book was a treatise on the properties of silver and moonstone and the binding of intention into worked metal, and Harry, who 4 days before had been getting the third sum wrong on purpose, read 40 pages of it and understood perhaps half, which was the most exhilarating half-understanding of his life. He needed the rest of the books, that was plain. One thin volume against his belly was a crime he could survive, a dozen heavy ones was not. But the books were in the library storeroom, in boxes marked a state of ACREWE, and the boxes would not stay there forever. They were passing through, on their way to wherever the solicitor had sent them, and if he wanted any of what was in them, he would have to act before the river carried them on. So on the 4th day, a Wednesday, when Petunia sent him out to be rid of him while her sister Marge's dog was visiting, Harry took the canvas bag, with the brain book and the borrowed bag folded inside it, and walked the 3 streets to the library to give back what he had taken and to find out very carefully where the dead woman's life was going next. Miss Pelham was at the desk when the green door stuck and gave and let him in. She looked up over her spectacles, and the ink stain on her cuff was a fresh blue today, and she said, "You're the one who left me a note," and Harry's heart did a small frightened thing before he understood that there was no anger in it. "I borrowed the bag," he said. "I brought it back, and the book." He set them on the desk, the bag folded neat, the brain book squared to the edge. "So you did." She took the book and turned it over and looked at the cover, the sliced head colored like a map. And then she looked at Harry, who was 7 and small and swimming in Dudley's old jumper, and something moved behind her spectacles that he could not read and did not like, because being read was being seen, and being seen was danger. "Heavy going, the brain," she said, "for a Saturday." "I didn't understand all of it," said Harry, which was true and safe and the kind of thing a dim boy said. "No," she agreed, "nor did the man who wrote it, I shouldn't think. That's rather the point of it." And she did the thing she had done with the atlas, which was to not ask him the question that any other adult would have asked, "Whose are you? Why are you alone? Why do you read about the brain at 7? And instead she reached into a drawer and took out a card, a proper library borrower's card, blank, and uncapped a pen. "If you're going to keep coming," she said, "you may as well be able to take the books out the front way, like a person, instead of leaving me notes." Name, he almost lied. The instinct to leave no mark rose in him hard, but a false name on a real card was a thread that could be pulled, and a true name on a card was the least of the marks he left in the world, and the silver's cold method, even unworn, even in daylight, weighed the two and chose. "Harry," he said, "Potter." If the name meant anything to her, nothing in her face showed it, and Harry, watching for exactly that, was as sure as he could be that it meant nothing, that here at least was a corner of the world where he was only a small boy and not a story. She wrote it on the card in a neat hand and stamped it and slid it across the desk to him, and it was the first thing he had ever owned that had his name on it and was given freely and could not be taken away as a punishment, and he held it for a moment too long before he put it in his pocket. "The box is in the back," he said, as if it were nothing, as if he were only making the talk that children made, the old ones with the books in funny writing. Now she did look at him a beat too long. "You've been in my storeroom," she said, but there was no heat in it, only a dry note that might almost have been amusement. "I wondered how a child found a canvas bag that lives behind my desk." "The door was open," said Harry. "I was hiding." Both true. Truth, the silver had shown him, was the best of all disguises because you could give people a true thing in a shape that told them nothing. Whose were they? An old lady's. Miss Pelham set down her pen. "Died up north, no family anyone could find, and some clever clerk discovered she'd once given money to a library, this library, would you believe, 50 years ago before my time, and so a box of her books came to us on the theory that we'd want them. We don't. They're in languages no one here reads, and 3 of them I can't even put a name to. The rest of her things are going to auction in town on Friday to pay her debts, such as they were. The books I'm to keep or bin as I see fit." She looked at the storeroom door, and something in her stooped shoulders said she did not like the binning of books any more than Harry would have. Why does a 7-year-old want to know about a dead woman's library? Because it is mine, Harry did not say. Because she was the last keeper of a thing I now keep, and her books are the manual, and I need them more than I have ever needed anything. "I liked the writing," he said. "It was pretty, the circles and the stars." He let his face be a child's face, open and a little silly. "Could I look at them? I won't take any. I'll come here to do it." And then, because the silver had taught him that a request is stronger when it costs the asker something, he added, "I'd dust them. The shelf's all dusty. I don't mind dusting." Miss Pelham looked at him for a long moment, the small boy in the enormous jumper offering to dust her storeroom for the privilege of staring at books he could not read, and whatever she saw she did not say. "We'll see," she said, which from her Harry was learning was not a no. "Come Friday afternoon. The lady's other things will be gone to town by then and the place to myself. You can look at your circles and your stars, and if you're any good with a duster I might even let you make yourself useful." She picked her pen back up, which meant the conversation was over, and Harry, who knew the grammar of dismissal better than he knew his alphabet, said thank you and went. He walked home the long way again, turning it over. He had a card with his name on it. He had Friday. He had the auction, which was a danger, the rest of her things, going out into the world where knowing eyes might see, but the books were staying, and the books would be, if he was careful and patient and dull, his. He did not let himself be glad about it on the street where a face could be seen. He saved the gladness for the dark. That night behind the board, with the house asleep and the silver cool on his brow, Harry decided it was time to stop only learning and to make something happen on purpose. He had been a boy to whom strange things happened. He did not want to be that any longer. A thing that happens to you owns you, a thing you do, you own. So he chose the smallest possible act, because the silver had taught him that you prove a principle on the smallest case and only then make it larger, and he looked at the airbrick low in the outer wall where the night came in, and where a single moth had blundered in out of the dark and was beating itself stupidly against the cold iron grate, trying to get back out to a moon it could see and not reach. Harry looked at the moth, and with the silver's clarity he understood, for the first time, what he had always done by accident. The strange things had been wishes, wild, frightened, total wishes, his whole self flung at a single want, the want to have the marmalade, the want to be away from Dudley, the want to not be hit. The magic had answered the wholeness of the wanting, not its words, and it had answered clumsily, hugely, because a wish has no precision in it. The silver showed him the thing underneath the wish, the actual act, the reaching out of intention to lay hold of the world and ask it, very exactly, to be other than it was. He did not need the whole of himself. He needed a part of himself, shaped right, pointed true. He did not need a wand. The book said a wand was a focus, a lens to gather and aim what a wizard already had, and a lens makes the work easier but is not the work. The work was the intention. He had the intention. He had now the clarity to shape it. He reached out not with his hand stayed folded in his lap, and he found the moth with that part of himself the way he might find a word on the tip of his tongue, and he did not wish it free wildly the way the old Harry would have. He understood the grate, the gap in the iron the moth was too foolish to find, the few inches of cold air between the insect and the open night. And he asked the moth gently, precisely, to go up into the left and out. The moth stopped beating against the grate. For a moment it hung in the dark, and Harry's heart hung with it. Then it rose and went left and slipped through the gap in the iron and was gone into the night in the unreachable moon, which was not unreachable after all, only badly aimed at. Harry sat in the dark with the silver cool on his brow and his hands folded in his lap and his eyes very wide, and he did not laugh this time and he did not smile, because the thing he felt was too large and too quiet for either. He had made it happen. Not a flood, not an accident, not a wish flung in terror. A single moth moved a few inches exactly where he meant. The smallest possible magic, done on purpose, understood completely. It was nothing. A child could not have been beaten for it, an adult would not have seen it. and it was the first deliberate act of a wizard who would, in the years that came, do things that the deliberate adults of his secret world had given up believing possible, and it had been done by a 7-year-old in a cupboard under the stairs, alone, in the dark, with a dead queen's wisdom cool against his brow, by the light of a moon he had just taught a moth to find. He took the silver off and put it behind the board and lay down, and this time he slept, and his sleep was deep and clear and without the green light in it, and in the morning the cupboard was only a cupboard again, and Harry Potter was only a small dull boy who got the third sum wrong on purpose, and no one in the whole sleeping world had the least idea that the smartest mind in it had just woken up under their stairs. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Impossible learning. The storeroom smelled of dust and radiator heat and the particular sweetness of old paper going slowly back to the earth, and on Friday afternoon, with the auction-bound furniture gone to town and the library quiet as a held breath, Miss Pelham handed Harry a duster and a promise she did not know she was making. "The shelf there," she said, pointing to the low run where she had stacked the dead woman's books, a dozen of them, dark and heavy and patient. "Dust them if you like, look at your circles and stars, and when you're bored of it, come and find me. Don't bend the spines." And she went back through to the desk and left a 7-year-old alone with the manual of a world. Harry dusted. He dusted very thoroughly, because the dusting was true and the truth was his cover, and while he dusted he read, and while he read he did the thing he had spent all week learning to do, which was to take a page in once completely, and carry it away in his head to be opened later in the dark. He could not wear the silver here. He did not need to. The silver had taught him a way of looking that worked even unworn, a way of pressing a page flat against his memory, so that it would still be there at midnight when the great clear room opened, and he could walk among the words at his leisure and make them mean something. So he sat cross-legged on the cold floor with a duster in one hand and a book open on his knees, a dull boy admiring pretty writing, and he read 40 pages, 60, 80, turning them at the unhurried pace of a child who cannot read them at all, and into his memory went the foundations of a magical education that grown wizards paid in years to acquire. The books were not a course. They were a life's library, gathered by a woman who had clearly read in every corner of the art, and the disorder of them was its own lesson, because Harry had to build the order himself, had to find the spine of the thing among the scattered bones. There was a grammar of charms, old and severe, that treated a spell as a sentence with a subject and an object and a mood, and Harry, who had just that week understood his accidental magic as badly aimed intention, felt the grammar lock onto his understanding like a key he had been carrying without a lock. There was a thick green volume on the theory of transfiguration, all of it about the difference between seeming and being, between making a thing look otherwise and making it be otherwise, and the price the second one charged that the first did not. There was a slim, cruel book, bound in something he did not like to touch, that he read 4 pages of enclosed, because the silver's clarity worked both ways and showed him plainly that some knowledge was a wound you gave yourself, and that the discipline of a great mind was not only in what it learned but in what it chose on purpose to leave shut. He set that one at the bottom of the stack and did not take it into his memory, and the choosing of that felt, oddly, like the most adult thing he had ever done. Miss Pelham looked in on him once, near closing, and found him exactly as she had left him, small and dusty and absorbed, and something in her stooped posture eased, as though she had half expected to find the boy gone or the books disturbed, and was obscurely glad to be wrong about a child for once. "You'll come back," she said, and again it was not a question, and Harry said yes and meant it, and she let him keep the duster on its hook with the unspoken understanding that the hook was his now, and the shelf, and the long quiet Friday afternoons when the place was hers, and she was willing to share it with a boy who asked her nothing and wanted only to read what no one else could. It was the nearest thing to friendship Harry had. He was careful never to let it become more than that, and the care of it was one of the quiet griefs of that year. The solicitor in the grey northern town remembered nothing useful and gave Mortlake everything anyway. It was done over a cup of tea the solicitor did not remember pouring, in an office above a chemist's, and it took the better part of an afternoon, because Mortlake did not believe in haste any more than he believed in mercy, and a memory taken too quickly tore, and a torn memory left a man frightened in a way that drew attention. So he was gentle. He sat across the desk with his good grey coat folded over his knee, and he asked his few quiet questions, and where the answers did not come freely he reached in and lifted them out, a card from the middle of a stacked deck, so smoothly that the stack never knew it had been touched. The effects of the late Miss Crewe, dispersed, yes. The furniture and the saleable items to a sale room in the town, gone under the hammer that very Friday, scattered now to 40 buyers and untraceable, which did not trouble Mortlake, because a guardian does not hide the great thing among the saleable items, a guardian hides it among the worthless ones. The worthless ones, the books, the unsold oddments, the boxes of sundry no auctioneer would waste a lot on. Where? The solicitor's hand had moved in the taking to a ledger, and Mortlake read it upside down before the man's own eyes had finished crossing the room. A charitable bequest, a library of all the quaint things in a place called Little Winging in Surrey, 400 miles south, chosen by a clerk's whim because the dead woman had once sent the place a check before the war. A box of books posted south. And the rest, the true sundry, the personal oddments, the leavings too small for a sale room. Mortlake's eye went down the ledger and found the line in the cold heron stillness of him went, for one instant, very slightly more still. The personal effects had gone south as well, to the same library, in the same consignment, a box marked in the clerk's board hand, sundry, personal, dispose at discretion. He let the solicitor pour him a second cup of tea he would also not remember, and he sat with the name of the town and the name of the library settling into him, and he did not feel triumph, because triumph made you slow, but he allowed himself the small professional satisfaction of a line drawn taut at last. 19 years, a box marked sundry, sent 400 miles south by accident to a suburban library that did not want it. The thing his client was dying to hold was sitting, in all likelihood, on a shelf in Surrey behind a desk, dusted by a librarian who had no idea what she swept. He capped his pen. He had a long way to travel and no reason at all to hurry, because a thing that has lain hidden 300 years does not run away in a week, and the only mistake a finder could make at this stage was to arrive too eager and be remembered. He would go south slowly. He would arrive as no one. And he would look with his patient knowing eye at a shelf of a dead woman's books, and he would see in an afternoon what 100 muggles had failed to see in a season. He went to the cold house full of clocks first, to tell the client he had a town and a name, because the client paid for hope as much as for results, and the client's hope was a thing Mortlake had learned to dole out like medicine. Halloway was worse. Mortlake saw it the moment the door opened, in the 100 clocks all running and all wrong now. 3 of them stopped, their hands fallen, no one left in the great cold house with the wit to wind them. The old man sat in his high chair and listened to the report, and twice in the telling of it he went away, the eyes emptying, the mouth slack, the door in his mind swinging shut and the man behind it gone. And the second time he came back he asked Mortlake to begin again, having lost the whole of it, and Mortlake began again in the same even voice, and watched a powerful mind go out in front of him like a tide, and understood with perfect clarity why the old man would pay anything, do anything, kill anything to lay his hands on a thing that the oldest rumors said could make a mind whole and vast and unforgetting. He understood it, he did not share it. He had buried his own wanting 30 years ago, and a man with no wants is very hard to frighten and impossible to bribe, and that, more than his stillness or his patience, was why Mortlake had lived long enough to grow old in the most dangerous trade there was. "Bring it," Halloway said at the door, his hand closing on Mortlake's sleeve with a strength his failing mind had not yet lost. Before there is no one left to wear it, you understand me, before there is no one left in here to wear it." And Mortlake, who understood him exactly, said that he did, and went out into the cold and left the old man among his stopping clocks. Harry learned faster than the books had been written to be learned, and he learned in the dark, and the dark filled that autumn with quiet miracles no one ever saw. He began with light, because light was the first thing the grammar of charms taught, and because a boy who lives in a cupboard understands the value of it. The forbidden bulb hung dead on its cord. He was not allowed to switch it on, and the click of the switch carried, and the line of light under the door would have betrayed him in an instant. So he made his own. With the silver cool on his brow he held in his mind the whole of what light was, the way the green book held the whole of what change was, and he asked the air above his palm to carry a small cold glow, no brighter than a coal, enough to read by and not enough to leak under a door. And after 4 nights of failing he succeeded, and sat in the cupboard with a sphere of pale light balanced over his open hand, reading a 300-year-old book on the properties of moonstone by a lamp he had made out of nothing but understanding. He did not need the bulb after that. He never used the bulb again. He learned motion, which the books called the simplest of the workings, and which Harry found the most beautiful, because it was the marmalade jar made obedient at last. He floated the marble from behind the loose board and turned it slowly in the air, and learned to do it precisely, a thing he could not have done as a leaking accident, the marble holding its height to the width of a hair, spinning at the speed he chose. He learned silence, a charm of muffling, drawn from the severe old grammar that he laid around the cupboard so that the small sounds of his nights, the turning of pages, the once in a while of a whispered word would not carry up the stairs. And the silence he made was the first thing he built that was purely for concealment, a wall around his secret raised by the secret itself, and the elegance of that pleased him in a way he was careful not to show even alone. And he learned to mend. His glasses had been broken at the bridge for as long as he could remember, mended with a twist of sellotape that yellowed and had to be replaced. A small daily humiliation. He had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing a stone in a shoe you cannot remove. One night with the silver on, reading the Green Book's chapter on restoration, on the difference between gluing a thing and making it whole, between the seeming mended and the truly mended, Harry took the glasses off his face and held them in the cold light he had made and looked at the break and understood it, the cheap wire, the metal fatigue, the place where the thing had ceased to be one thing and become two pretending. And he asked it to be one thing again, not taped, not glued. Whole as it had been made, as if the break had never happened. The wire flowed under his attention like water finding its level, and the two pretending halves remembered that they had been one, and the break closed without a seam, and Harry put the glasses back on and looked through them at his own hands in the light, and the bridge sat cool and unbroken on his nose for the first time in his memory, and he sat very still for a while because it was a small thing and it had undone 1,000 small days. And there are griefs a person does not know the size of until the moment they are mended. He took the sellotape off in the morning and threw it away. If Petunia noticed that the boy's glasses had healed themselves, she said nothing, because to notice Harry was to think about Harry, and she had spent 10 years training herself out of it, and her training, like his, held. The book spoke often of the wand, and the more Harry read the more he understood that he was doing without the one tool the whole of his secret world took for granted. A wand, the severe grammar said, was not the source of a wizard's power but its instrument, a lens to gather the diffuse intention of the mind and aim it to a point, the way a glass gathers sunlight to a burning dot. A wizard without a wand was not powerless. He was a man trying to thread a needle by the light of the whole sky at once, dazzled by his own abundance. Most could barely do it. The books described wandless magic as a feat of masters, a thing the great old witches managed after lifetimes of discipline, and here was Harry doing it nightly in a cupboard, moving marbles to the width of a hair, because the silver had given him at 7 the one thing the masters spent their lifetimes building. The ability to gather his own intention to point without a lens at all, to thread the needle by holding the whole sky still in his mind and choosing, exactly, the single strand of it he wanted. He did not have a wand. He was beginning to suspect, reading the masters describe his impossible feats as the summit of their art, that he might be the kind of wizard who would one day need a wand less than anyone alive. He set the suspicion aside unproven because the silver had taught him not to fall in love with a flattering idea before he had tested it, but he kept it, the way you keep a coin you are not yet sure is real. He made himself a focus anyway to learn the principle of the thing. Not a wand was wood and a core and a wizard's whole history of buying one in a shop he could not reach, but a focus, a length of the wire that had once been his glass's broken arm which he had kept, and which he worked between his fingers each night until he understood by doing what a lens did. With the wire in his hand the workings came easier, the marble steadier, the cold light brighter. Without it they came at the cost of a small constant effort, like reading without his glasses. He learned the difference in his own hands, which was the only way he ever truly learned anything, and having learned it he put the wire away because a focus could be found and a focus could be taken, and the safest tool was the one that lived inside his own skull where no one could search for it. He would carry the lens in his mind. He had carried everything else there. What he could not carry, what no working in any of the dead woman's books could give him, was someone to show it to. There was a boy at school called Tom Selby, not one of Dudley's, a quiet boy with a stammer who got picked on for it and who had, one wet lunchtime, sat down next to Harry against the radiator and shown him a beetle in a matchbox, and talked about beetles haltingly for 20 minutes, with the helpless gladness of a child who has found someone who will not laugh. Harry had listened and asked questions, and the questions had lit Tom Selby up like a lamp, and for 20 minutes Harry had been, simply, a boy with a friend and a beetle, and it had been so good and so easy that it frightened him more than any of the dangers in the cruel book. Because the next day Tom Selby had sought him out again, and the day after, and Harry had understood where it led to closeness, to trust, to a friend who would in time notice things, the healed glasses, the strange stillness, the answers that came too fast when Harry forgot to be careful, and he had made himself, over the course of a gray, careful week, become boring. He gave Tom Selby less. He looked away during the beetle talk. He let the silences fall and did not pick them up, until the lamp went out and the quiet boy with the stammer drifted off to be lonely somewhere else, and Harry sat against the radiator at lunchtime alone, which was where he had started, and told himself it was the price, and believed himself, because he was getting terribly good at being believed by the only person who ever listened to him, which was himself. That was the loneliness the silver could not mend, and would not have mended if it could, because the silver only ever made him more himself, and what he was underneath was a boy who had decided that understanding was worth more than company, and who got to find out slowly, in a cupboard in a classroom and a wet lunchtime against a radiator, exactly how much that decision cost. The box marked Sundry had come south with the books, and Miss Pelham, who could not bear to bin a thing until she had failed to find it a home, had pushed it under the bottom shelf of the storeroom and forgotten it, and on a Friday in November Harry, dusting, found it again, and in it, beneath the spectacles and the stopped watch and the chipped teacup with its faded rabbit, the bundle of letters tied with ribbon. He should not have read them. He read them. A reader does not leave a letter shut any more than a book, and these were the letters of the woman whose silver lay behind his loose board 8 inches from his sleeping head, and Harry wanted to know who she had been more than he had wanted anything since the night he first lifted the band to his brow. He untied the ribbon with careful fingers and read them in the cold storeroom light, a dull boy admiring old handwriting, and the handwriting told him things the books never could. Most of the letters were ordinary, the long, quiet correspondence of a long, quiet life, a cousin in Canada, a friend gone before her, the small weather of decades. But the ribbon held 3 together at the bottom that were not ordinary, 3 in the spidery hand he had first read on the boxes themselves, drafts, it seemed, of letters a Delphine crew had written and perhaps never sent, and these were addressed to no one or to everyone or to whoever came after, and Harry read them 3 times each and carried every word into the dark. "I am the last," one of them said, "and there is no one to give the keeping to, and I am too old now to do what my mother did, and her mother, which was to find the next pair of hands while the hands were young. The line has run out in me. I had thought there would always be a daughter. There is no daughter. There is only the thing itself, and my failing care of it, and the certainty that has never left me in 80 years, which is that they will come for it the moment I am gone. They always come. They came for my grandmother, and she turned them away at the cost I will not write down, and they came for my mother, and they will come for whatever poor soul holds it after me. And there will be no one to teach that soul what it is, or how it chooses, or why it must never be sold or shown or surrendered. I have hidden it as my mother's hid it, among the worthless things where only the worthy eye will find it. It is the best I can do. It is not enough. God forgive me, I am tired, and it is not enough." Harry sat very still on the cold floor with the letter in his hands, and the dust turned slowly in the light from the high window, and he understood several things at once, the way he understood things now, all at once and whole. He understood that the silver was not lost treasure that had fallen to him by luck. It was a kept thing, guarded across generations by a line of women, hidden each time among worthless things so that only a worthy eye would find it, and the last of those women had died with no one to take up the keeping, and the silver, how it chooses, she had written, why it must never be surrendered, the silver had chosen in the back of a Surrey library, the worthy eye of a 7-year-old boy hiding from his cousin. He had not found it. It had let itself be found by him because he was what it was looking for, and the wonder of that was so large that he had to set it down and not look at it directly for a while. And he understood the other thing, the cold thing, the thing the dead woman had written in a hand that shook. They will come for it the moment I am gone. They always come. She was gone. The keeping had passed by the silver's own choosing to him. And somewhere in the world behind the world, by the iron logic of a thing that had been true for 300 years, someone had already turned south, already begun, already started walking along a thread toward a Surrey town and a library and a loose board under a flight of stairs, because they always came. The dead woman had promised it across her own grave, and the only question Harry's clear, cold mind could not yet answer was how close they already were. He tied the ribbon back exactly as it had been. He put the letters at the bottom of the box and the box back under the shelf, and he dusted the shelf because the dusting was true and the truth was his cover, and he said goodbye to Miss Pelham at the desk in the same dull, small voice as always, and walked home the long way with 300 years of warning folded into his perfect memory. He did not let his face change on the street where a face could be seen. But behind the gray wall he had built, in the bright country no reader had yet tried to enter, a new thing had taken its place beside the wonder and the loneliness, and the new thing was the knowledge that he was not only the smartest boy in the world and the most alone. He was, by the choosing of a dead queen's silver and the failing of a dead woman's line, the last guardian of a thing that men had killed for, and would kill for again, and that the killing, the warning said, was already on its way. It was in the slim, cruel book he had chosen not to memorize that Harry first read of the reading of minds, and the reading of it changed everything he thought he knew about safety. He had closed the book on its 4th page in the storeroom, because some of its knowledge was a wound. But the silver's clarity had carried those 4 pages away whether he willed it or not, and one of them, the least cruel, had described a thing the book called legilimency, the art of entering another's mind, of reading the thoughts behind the face, the memories behind the eyes, as plainly as Harry read a dusted page. He turned it over that night with the silver on, and the turning of it ran a cold finger down the whole architecture of his secret. Because his whole plan, the plan he had laid on the very first night, rested on a single assumption, that what was inside his head was his unreachable safe, that he could be a dull boy on the outside and keep the bright country hidden within, and that no one could ever get at it so long as he kept his face right and his sums wrong, and the slim, cruel book said that the assumption was false. There were people in the world behind the world who could open a mind like a book and read it cover to cover, and against such a person his careful face was nothing, his clumsy catch of the marmalade jar was nothing, his wrong third sum was nothing, because they would not be reading his face. They would be reading the country behind it, the light he had made and the books he had memorized and the silver behind the loose board, all of it laid out plain for the taking. He did not panic. He had given up panic on the first night. He did what the silver had taught him to do with every danger, which was to turn and face it and take it apart. If a mind could be read, then a mind could be guarded. The book that named the lock would, somewhere, name the key. He went back into the storeroom on the next Friday and took the slim, cruel book up again, and made himself read past the 4th page this time, holding the silver's discipline around him like a coat against the cold of it, and he found the counterart the book named in passing and dismissed as a thing few ever mastered. The building of walls within the mind, the ordering of thought into rooms with doors that closed, so that a reader entering found only what the defender chose to leave on show. The book said it took most who attempted it years, and that most never managed it at all, because it required a person to be able to watch their own thinking from the outside, to stand at the door of their own mind and decide what showed. Harry could watch his own thinking from the outside. The silver had given him that on the very first night the machinery laid bare, the page rising whole, the record kept without his asking. The one thing the book said was hardest was the one thing he already had, so he built. Night after night, with the silver cool on his brow, he raised the walls, not as the book described them, which he found clumsy and slow, but as his own clearer method showed him, an architecture of his own design, a dull gray antechamber that any reader would enter first and mistake for the whole, a mind that looked exactly like the mind of a beaten ordinary boy, and behind it, walled and doored and silent, the bright country, the books, the light, the silver, the truth. He built it the way he built everything that year, faster than it had ever been built, alone in the dark, for reasons he could share with no one, and when it was done he could feel it, a stillness at the center of him, a held breath that did not tire. He did not know yet whether it would hold against a true reader. He hoped he would never have to learn. But he had stopped that autumn believing that hope was a plan, and he had built the wall, and the building of it was the smartest thing a 7-year-old had ever done in the dark under a flight of stairs, and no one knew, and that was the point of it, and that was the loneliness of it, and Harry had made his peace with both. The Green Book of Change was the hardest of all the dead woman's books, and Harry came to it last on purpose, the way you save the steepest part of a climb for when your legs are strong. Transfiguration, the book said, was not motion and not light and not mending. It was the deepest of the ordinary arts, because it asked a thing to stop being what it was and to be something else instead, not to seem otherwise, which any cheap glamour could manage, but to be otherwise, down to the grain of it, truly and wholly changed. The book was stern about the difference, sterner than about anything else, and Harry understood the sternness once he tried the thing and felt the cost of it in his own mind. He began, as the book began, with the smallest possible change on the smallest possible thing. A pebble he had carried up from the garden, set on his knee in the cold light he had made, asked to become a button, not painted to look like a button, made one. He held the whole of what a pebble was and the whole of what a button was, both at once, complete, and he found the place where the one could be persuaded into the other, and he asked precisely the way he had asked the moth to find the gap in the grate, and the pebble was a button gray horn with 4 small holes, sitting on his knee where the stone had been, and it was not a stone pretending. He turned it over in the cold light. It was a button all the way through. It cost him more than the light or the marble ever had, a deep, clean tiredness behind the eyes, because the Green Book was right. To change a thing's being and not merely its seeming was to spend something real, and a wizard who changed too much too fast would empty himself the way a purse empties. So he rationed the changing as he rationed everything, a little each night, and learned its laws by paying their prices in his own small body, learned that living things resisted what dead things permitted, that the more a thing wished to stay itself the dearer it cost to change it, that the change wanted always to slip back, so that a true transfiguration had to be made to hold, or it would quietly undo itself in a day or a week, and the button would remember it had been a stone. He learned to make them hold. He turned the button to a beetle once, a real one, that walked on his palm on 6 new legs and waved its feelers at the cold light, alive where a moment before there had been horn and before that stone, and he sat looking at the small living thing he had made out of a pebble from the garden and felt the size of what the silver had given him, because the Green Book said plainly that the changing of dead matter into living was an art that grown witches labored years to touch, and many never touched at all. And Harry had done it in the dark at 7, on the floor of a cupboard, by the light of a lamp he had made out of understanding. He turned the beetle back to a stone, gently, with a word of apology to it that he could not have explained, and he set the stone on the windowsill of his memory beside all the other things he had done that no one would ever see, and he understood that he had stopped somewhere in these nights being a wizard who was learning quickly, and become a wizard who was simply ahead of the books, ahead of the masters who had written them, ahead, as far as he could tell, of anyone now living. Alone at the front of a thing with no one beside him to say whether he had gone too far. That was the loneliness inside the wonder, and it sharpened as the wonder grew, because every new impossible thing he learned to do was one more thing he could show to no one. He thought sometimes, lying in the dark after the silver was back behind the board, of what it would be to have even one person in the world he could simply tell, to turn a pebble into a beetle on a kitchen table and watch someone's face change, to be, for 1 minute, not the smartest hidden thing in England, but only a clever boy doing a clever trick for a friend. He did not have that and would not, and the silver was honest with him about why. The moment he showed a single soul, the soul became a keeper of his secret, and a keeper of his secret was a hunter or a victim, and he had sworn on the first night to make no one either. So he turned his beetles back into stones alone and showed them to the dark, and the dark kept his secrets as it had always kept them. And Harry learned the deepest of the ordinary arts the way he had learned every other thing in his strange, bright, lonely year, by himself, for reasons he could share with no one, at a speed that would have frightened the grown world far more than any leak of wild magic, because wild magic was only power, and what Harry had become in the dark under the stairs was something the masters who wrote the stern green book had never quite dared to be: precise, patient, ahead, and entirely, permanently unseen. People, he discovered, were the easiest magic of all and the most dangerous to practice, and he taught himself to leave them mostly alone. He could read them now without trying. He could sit at the breakfast table and know Vernon's mood before Vernon did, could see the small mechanisms by which Petunia talked herself into and out of things, could watch Dudley's wants move across his fat face like clouds. And reading shaded, he found, very quickly into steering. He did it once, deliberately, as an experiment, because the silver had taught him to prove a principle on the smallest case. Vernon had been working himself up over supper toward one of his slow-building rages, the kind that ended with Harry's door locked and a missed meal, and Harry, watching the weather of it gather, said nothing and did nothing with his hands, but reached out the way he had reached for the moth, and found the small turning point in the man's mind, the moment where the rage would either crest or break, and he did not push it. Pushing a mind, the cruel book had warned, left marks. He only let the man's eye fall on the thing that would distract him, the television, the football scores, by the smallest arrangement of the moment, and the rage broke and dispersed into grumbling, and the evening went by without a locked door. It worked, that was the trouble. It worked perfectly, and no one saw, and Harry sat in his cupboard afterward and understood that he had just discovered the most tempting power he would ever hold, the power to reach into the people who hurt him and turn them gently aside, and that if he used it freely he would become something he did not want to be, a boy who solved every person like a sum, who never again met another mind as an equal because he could always quietly win. The silver did not stop him. The silver never stopped him, it only ever made him more himself and showed him with its terrible clarity exactly what each road cost. He looked down the road of steering people and saw a person at the end of it that he did not want to be, and he stepped back from it mostly, keeping the art for the smallest defenses, the breaking of a rage, the sliding out of a corner, and leaving the rest of it unused, a loaded thing he chose on purpose not to fire. It was the same choosing as the cruel book at the bottom of the stack. He was learning that the discipline of a great mind was made as much of the doors it kept shut as the ones it opened, and he was learning it at 7, alone, with no one to tell him he had chosen well, which was the only kind of choosing that counted. Mr. Whitby was new that term, and Mr. Whitby watched. He was a young teacher, too young to have learned not to care, with chalk dust permanently on the cuff of his jacket and the dangerous habit of actually looking at the children in front of him. Most teachers saw a class. Mr. Whitby saw boys one at a time, and somewhere in the third week of term his eye began to come to rest, now and then, on the small one at the back and the enormous jumper who got the third sum wrong. Harry felt it before he understood it. He came up out of a daydream one afternoon to find Mr. Whitby looking at him, not crossly, not the way teachers looked at troublemakers, but with a small puzzled attention, the look of a man working at a problem that did not add up, and Harry's stomach dropped because he knew exactly what the problem was. The problem was the pattern. Harry got the third sum wrong. He got the fourth question on the reading sheet wrong. He had been doing it for weeks, a careful schedule of failure designed to keep him in the gray middle, and he had designed it as a boy designs a thing with too much order in it. And Mr. Whitby, who looked at boys one at a time, had begun, without quite knowing it, to see the order. A boy who is genuinely middling fails at random. Harry failed on a rhythm. And a young teacher with chalk on his cuff and the habit of looking had started to notice that the small, silent boy at the back got wrong, with suspicious reliability, exactly the questions a clever boy would get right. It came to a head over a comprehension test, a passage about a shipwreck with questions beneath it, and one of the questions was not a question of fact but of inference. Why did the captain stay aboard? And it had no answer on the page. It had only an answer in the mind of a reader who understood, and Harry, tired that day, his guard a half-second slow, wrote the true answer before he caught himself. He saw at the moment his pencil lifted, the clean, clear sentence sitting on the line, a sentence no middling 7-year-old in that class could have written, a window thrown open in the gray wall he had built so carefully, and he could not unwrite it. The ink was down, and he handed the test in with the window open in it, and spent the rest of the afternoon in a quiet dread he was careful not to show. Mr. Whitby read the tests that evening. Harry did not see him do it, but he did not need to. He could construct it perfectly. The young man at his desk under a lamp, the stack of middling answers, and then the one that was not middling, the shipwreck answer, the clean, clear sentence about why a captain stays aboard, in the cramped, careful hand of the boy who got the third sum wrong. He could see Mr. Whitby read it twice. He could see him set it apart from the others. He could see him sit back and look at nothing and begin to wonder, the way Miss Pelham had once or twice begun to wonder and been turned aside. The way every person who looked at Harry too long began to wonder, and the wondering was the danger. The wondering was the thread that pulled, unraveled everything, and Harry lay in his cupboard that night with the silver behind the board and did not put it on, because he did not need its clarity to see what he had to do. He had to close the window. He had to be more careful than he had ever been, more careful than a child should ever have to be, because a kind young man with chalk on his cuff had caught one clean glimpse of the truth, and kindness was not safety, and a person who wondered about Harry Potter had to be, gently and completely, given nothing more to wonder about. He would not steer Mr. Whitby. He had ruled out the steering of people mostly, and a teacher's mind was not a thing he would break for his own convenience. He would do it the hard way, the honest way, the way that cost him and not the other man. He would become, more thoroughly than ever, the dull boy. He would fail at random now, not on a rhythm. He would let the clean sentences die unwritten on his tongue. He would bury the shipwreck answer and 10,000 answers like it under a gray blankness so complete that even a man who looked at boys one at a time would find nothing in this one to hold his eye. He would kill the visible part of himself a little more every day so that the invisible part could go on living, and he would do it alone and tell no one why, and the price of it sat on his chest in the dark like a stone he had chosen to carry. He was 7 years old. He had found the greatest treasure in the world, and the keeping of it was teaching him, lesson by quiet lesson, exactly how alone a person could be while holding the thing everyone else would kill to have. He looked at the price one more time in the dark, and then he set his jaw and began in his head to plan the careful, unremarkable ruin of the one clean sentence that had nearly given him away, because that was the work now, and Harry had never in his life been afraid of work. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Hiding the genius. By the spring, Harry had turned concealment into an art as fine as any in the dead woman's books, and the finest part of it was that no one ever knew there was an art at all. A clumsy hider draws the eye by the labor of his hiding. Harry had learned that on the night of the wrong third sum, when his very orderliness had begun to show Mr. Whitby a pattern, and he had taken the lesson the way he took all of them completely. The trick was not to fail on a schedule. The trick was not to fail at all in any way a watcher could chart, but to be in every measurable particular exactly the boy the world already believed him to be, and the world believed him to be nothing, a quiet, undersized child of no account, and nothing was a remarkably difficult thing to perform well. He performed it. He let his work be middling in the scattered, careless, genuinely unremarkable way of a child whose mind was elsewhere, because a child whose mind is elsewhere is the least interesting thing in any classroom, and Harry made certain his mind appeared to be precisely nowhere at all. He answered when called on, wrongly often enough, rightly often enough, in the bored, flat voice of a boy reciting. He stopped writing clean sentences. He buried the shipwreck answer and every answer like it under a gray blankness so total that within a month Mr. Whitby's puzzled eye had begun, by careful design, to slide off him again. But sliding off was not enough, because an eye that is once caught on a thing remembers the catching, and Harry did not want to be a thing Mr. Whitby ever wondered about again. So he did the harder thing, the clever thing, the thing that cost him most. He gave the young teacher a story that explained everything and closed the case for good. Over the course of that term he let himself improve, slowly, unremarkably. By the small, grudging degrees of a neglected boy who has been quietly encouraged by the one adult who bothered with him, because Mr. Whitby was the kind of young man who needed to believe his bothering mattered, and Harry, reading him with the silver's residue, gave him exactly that to believe. He let Mr. Whitby catch him reading, once, a book a notch above his year and looked pleased and lent him another. He let his marks creep up from the bottom of the class to the unremarkable middle, on a curve that any teacher would read as the fruit of his own kindly attention, and Mr. Whitby read it so and was warmed by it, and stopped looking at the small boy in the back as a problem that did not add up and began to look at him instead as a quiet success, a child he had reached. A reached child is a closed case. Harry had taken the most dangerous eye in his daylight world, and without one unkind word, without one push to the man's mind, turned it from suspicion to satisfaction, and the man never knew he had been managed and went home happier for it, and that was the part Harry held on to on the nights when the managing felt like a kind of theft. He had not harmed Mr. Whitby. He had given him a good story and let him keep it. It was the gentlest weapon he owned, and he had used it gently, and it had worked perfectly, and the perfection of it was its own small loneliness, because there was no one he could tell how cleverly he had been kind. It was Mr. Whitby, in the end, who gave Harry the warm thing and the warning both, in the same gray April afternoon, without knowing he had given either. He kept Harry back after the others had gone, and Harry's stomach did its old drop until he saw that there was no problem in the young man's face, only the awkward gentleness of an adult about to overstep. "I wanted to say," Mr. Whitby began, turning a piece of chalk over in his fingers, "that you've come on, this year. You've come on a great deal, and I don't think—" He hesitated, and Harry watched him decide to say the true thing instead of the safe one. "I don't think anyone much tells you that, so I'm telling you. You've a good head on you, Harry, better than your marks, better, I'd say, than this place gives you a chance to show. Whatever's waiting for you out there, you'll do more with it than people expect. I just wanted you to have heard it from someone." And Harry, 7 years old, the smartest mind in England, standing in a chalk-dusted classroom in an enormous hand-me-down jumper, felt the whole gray, careful wall he had built shiver under the simple weight of being seen kindly, and understood with a clarity that hurt that Mr. Whitby had given him, by accident, the most dangerous gift in his daylight world, the truth said warmly by someone who meant it, because Mr. Whitby had seen him. Not all of him, not the country behind the wall, but more than anyone else had ever seen, enough to say better than your marks, enough to half know, and half-knowing was the thread that pulled, unraveled everything. The kindest adult in Harry's life had just told him gently that he had failed to hide as completely as he believed, and Harry had to take that warning and act on it coldly, even as the warmth of the words sat in his chest like the first hot meal of a long winter. "Thank you, sir," he said in the dull, flat voice, and let his face be the face of a boy who has not quite understood the compliment, and watched a flicker of disappointment cross Mr. Whitby's open features, the disappointment of a man whose kindness has not landed, and made himself leave it there unlanded, because a boy who understood that compliment was a boy worth wondering about, and Harry could not afford one more person who wondered. He gathered his bag and said thank you again, more dully still, and went, and did not look back at the young man standing among the empty desks with his chalk and his unreceived gift, and it was one of the cruelest things Harry ever did, and he did it to be kind, and the knot of that sat in him for years. He understood, walking home the long way, that this was the true shape of his life now. The warmth and the warning would always come together. Every person who got close enough to give him the first would, by getting that close, become the second. He could be seen or he could be safe. He could not be both. He had chosen safe on the very first night, in the dark, completely, the way the silver had taught him to choose, and the choosing did not stop being true just because a kind young man with chalk on his cuff had made it hurt. He buried the warmth where he buried everything, in the bright country no one could enter, and he kept walking, and the keeping was the loneliest competence he owned. There was, he had come to realize, more than one kind of watcher in his life, and the second kind did not go to a chalk-dusted classroom or wonder kindly about his marks. He had felt it for months without naming it, a sense, faint and persistent, of being held in someone's attention, and not the casual attention of neighbors. It clung to Privet Drive itself, to the streets around it, thickest near the house of the old woman with all the cats. Harry had begun, with the silver's clarity, to notice the pattern of it the way he noticed every pattern now. The cats were too many and too watchful, and too often exactly where he was going to be. The old woman knew his name and his comings and goings with a precision that no merely nosy neighbor bothered to keep. And there was, woven faint into the very air of the place, around the boundaries of number 4, a residue he had learned to feel since the night he made his first light, the residue of working, of magic laid down and maintained, old and strong and not his, wrapped around the house he slept in like a hand cupped around a candle. He worked it out over a careful month, the way he worked everything out, and the conclusion was not comfortable. Someone in the world behind the world knew where Harry Potter was. Someone had laid magic around the Dursleys' house and set a watcher among the cats, and meant, by every sign Harry could read, to keep him watched and warded and in place. The intention behind it did not feel like the cold thing from the dead woman's letters. It did not feel like a hunter. If anything, it felt protective, a guarding, as though somewhere a person of great power had decided that this particular neglected boy mattered enough to ward, and Harry turned that over a long time, the idea that he mattered to someone he had never met, and found in it a small unwilling warmth and a very large alarm. Because protective or not, a watcher was a watcher, and to be watched was to risk being seen changed, and Harry had a thing behind a loose board that no watcher, however kindly meant, could ever be allowed to know he had. So he tightened. He had been careful before, now he became careful past the point any child should have to reach. He never made his light, never floated his marble, never spoke the smallest working anywhere but in the warded silence of his cupboard with the muffling laid thick around it. He did nothing near the cats but be a dull, beaten boy. He let the protective watcher see, day after gray day, exactly the child it expected to see, unremarkable, unmagical, unhappy in the ordinary way, and gave it nothing ever to write home about. He did not resent the watcher. He understood dimly that the warding might be the only reason he had lived at all. But he could not trust it because trust was not safety, and the country behind his wall held a secret that the kindest power in the world would feel obliged to take from a 7-year-old for his own protection, and Harry had no intention of surrendering the best thing that had ever happened to him to anyone's protection, however well meant. He would keep himself hidden from the ones who wished him well exactly as carefully as from the ones who wished him harm. It was a strange and lonely arithmetic to hide from your own guardians, and Harry did the sum and accepted the answer and told no one, because there was no one, which was the answer to every sum that mattered now. If he was watched on every side, Harry decided, then he needed a map, and so he set himself, through that long spring, to learn the country he was hidden in. The dead woman's books were a magical education, but they were the education of a single old scholar, deep in some corners and silent in others, and they assumed in their reader 1,000 things a boy raised in a cupboard did not know. They never explained the world, they only ever spoke from inside it, the way a book of seamanship never bothers to mention that the sea is wet. So Harry read between their lines and built the world up out of its own assumptions, fact by fact, the way an astronomer builds a planet he cannot see out of the wobble of the ones he can. There was a government, the books referred to it sidelong, with the wariness scholars reserve for governments, as the ministry, a thing of departments and laws and enforcers that policed the working of magic and, above all, policed its secrecy from the ordinary world. There was a currency and shops and a quarter in London the books named in passing as though every reader had walked it. There was a school. This was the discovery that stopped him for 3 whole nights because the books mentioned it the way you mention a thing too obvious to describe. A school in the north to which the magical children of Britain went at 11, where they were taught the very arts Harry was teaching himself in the dark at 7. He turned the fact over and over. At 11 a letter would come, the books implied, the way the rain came to every child like him. He had 3.5 years. In 3.5 years a door would open in his hidden life whether he willed it or not, and he would walk through it into a place full of people who could read minds and lay wards and wield the very power he had been so carefully hiding, and he would have to decide before then exactly who the boy who walked through that door was going to be. And there was a war. The books were old, most of them, and silent on it, but one was not, a slim recent thing, a printed almanac of the magical year that had come south in the bequest by accident, and that spoke, in its dry chronicler's voice, of a terror only lately ended. A dark wizard unnamed in the almanac, as though the naming were still unsafe, who had risen and murdered and very nearly won, and who had been brought down, the almanac said, on the last night of October 7 years past, in a village called Godric's Hollow, defeated by the only thing that had ever defeated him, which was an infant who lived. Harry read the date and the place, and the green light rose unbidden out of his perfect memory, and his mother's voice saying, not Harry, please," and he sat in the cold storeroom with the almanac open on his knees and understood, all at once and whole, that the war the book described and the green light in his own oldest memory were the same thing. That the unnamed dark wizard had come to a cottage in Godric's Hollow on the last night of October, and killed a man and a woman who laughed in a photograph he was not allowed to have, and had turned his green light on their infant son, and that the infant who lived, the one the whole hidden world apparently knew of, and Harry had never until that moment known he was him. He did not put the silver on that night. He did not need it to see the shape of what he was. He was not only the last guardian of a dead queen's wisdom, hidden in a cupboard from watchers on every side. He was in the country behind the world, already a story, already a name, already a thing the hidden world watched and warded and waited for, which explained, with a cold completeness that took his breath, the cats and the wards around number 4 and the protective attention woven into the air of Privet Drive. He had wondered why a neglected boy should matter enough to guard. Now he knew. He mattered to that world before he had ever done a single thing, for a reason he could not remember and had not chosen, and the mattering was a kind of cage as surely as the cupboard was, and the most dangerous fact in his whole dangerous life was this: that he was a boy the wizarding world already had a use for, and a boy who had quietly become the smartest wizard alive, and that those 2 boys must never, ever be allowed to be seen as the same boy, because the day they were, his hidden country would be taken from him by people who would all, every one of them, be perfectly certain they were doing it for his own good. So the map, when he finished drawing it, frightened him more than the hunter did. The hunter wanted one thing and could be outthought. The world wanted to help him and could not be reasoned with at all. The craft of it was tested, that spring. In the small ways a thing is always tested before it is tested in earnest, and Harry passed each test by the margin of a held breath. There was the afternoon Dudley's gang cornered him properly at last, 4 of them in the alley behind the garages with no grown-up street in sight, and the old leaking magic rose in Harry the way it had risen all his life. The whole self wished to be away, to be safe, to be anywhere but here, and a year ago it would have flung him onto a roof or turned someone's hair blue or done some huge uncontrolled impossible thing that the protective watcher in the cats would have felt from 3 streets away. Harry caught it. That was the test, and that was the passing. He felt the power gather to throw itself, the old reflex of a hunted child, and with the silver's discipline cold and clear in him, even unworn, he took hold of it before it broke loose and folded it back down and made himself, instead, do the small, ordinary human things a powerless boy did, which was to take the shove and go down and curl up small and let it be over. He could have scattered them like leaves. He understood, lying in the grit of the alley with Dudley's laughter overhead, that the not doing was the harder magic by far, harder than the moth or the light or the mended glasses, to hold the whole of his power still inside a body being hurt, to be beaten when he could have flung them off, because a flung gang was a thing the watchers would see, and a beaten boy was invisible, and invisible was safe. He walked home bruised and intact, his secret bruised and intact with him, and counted it a victory, which was the strangest accounting of his strange life, that being hurt and hiding it was a thing he could put in the win column. There was the evening Petunia, cleaning out the cupboard in one of her sudden furies, very nearly put her hand on the loose board. Harry had been at school. He came home to find her on her knees half inside his cupboard with a duster, and his heart stopped, because the silver lay 8 inches from her hand, wrapped in a dead woman's shawl, and a single tug at the wrong board would end everything. He did not panic. He had given up panic on the first night. He stood in the hall in his dull, flat boy's body and reached out the way he had reached for the moth, gently, precisely, and he did not touch his aunt's mind. He had ruled out the breaking of minds, but he found the small, loose thing on the high shelf above her, the tin of polish with the lid not quite on, and asked it, with the lightest possible asking, to tip. It tipped. It came down on the back of Petunia's neck in a cold, wet slap of polish, and she shrieked and backed out of the cupboard and forgot the loose board entirely in her fury at the mess, and spent the next hour cleaning polish out of her collar and cursing the shelf, and the board stayed unpulled, and the silver stayed hidden, and Harry, who had arranged the whole of it in the space of a breath, made his face the face of a boy bewildered and a little frightened by his aunt's temper, and was sent to his cupboard early as a punishment, which was exactly where he had wanted to be all along. He lay behind the closed door in the warded silence and let himself feel, for one moment, the size of what he was becoming. A year ago he had been a boy to whom strange things happened, helpless, blamed, leaking power he could not hold. Now he sat at the center of his own small life like a spider at the center of a web, feeling every thread, and when danger touched a strand he answered it with a tip of a polished tin, a fallen book, a broken rage. A moth moved 3 inches, never the great visible magic that would betray him, always the smallest possible turn of the world that would serve. He had not become powerful in the way the dark wizard of the almanac had been powerful, with green light and terror. He had become something the almanac did not have a word for, precise. And precision, he was beginning to understand, was a kind of power the loud and hungry men of his hidden world had never learned, because they had never had to. He had had to. The cupboard had taught him, and the silver had taught him, and between the two of them they had made, under the stairs at number 4, the most carefully hidden mind in Britain, and the hiding was the masterpiece, and no one would ever applaud it, and Harry had stopped somewhere that spring expecting applause. 200 miles away, in the cold house full of clocks, Lucian Halloway was running out of time in every sense the word allowed. He had been once a man of formidable gifts. The narrow world that placed its death notices in pages without titles had spoken his name with the particular hush it kept for the brilliant and the dangerous, and he had earned the hush, in his long prime, by a mind that forgot nothing and forgave less. That was the cruelty of what was happening to him now, and he felt the cruelty as a personal insult, as the deliberate malice of a universe that had singled him out. The mind that had been his glory was going, room by room, like a great house being closed up for the last time, the dust sheets coming down over the furniture, the doors locked one by one from the outside. There was a curse in it. He had known that for years, a slow, elegant working laid on him by an enemy long dead, a thing no healer could lift because no healer could find its anchor, and it ate his memory the way rust eats iron, from the inside, invisibly, until a beam that looked whole gave way under the lightest weight, and a whole wing of him fell into the dark. He would be in the middle of a thought, and the thought would simply end, the floor gone from under it, and he would stand in the wreckage of his own mind, not knowing what he had been reaching for, and the terror of those moments was the only thing he had left that was undiminished. He had spent a fortune on healers, and learned only that he was dying in the one way he could not bear, not in the body but in the self. And then, in the deep archives of the dead, he had found the old rumor, and the rumor had become his whole reason to go on breathing. There had been a thing once. A diadem made by one of the founders of the very school the children of Britain still went to, made by the wisest of them, and made, the rumor said, and the rumor was very old and very persistent, to hold and to give what its maker had loved above all things, which was the mind entire, memory perfect, understanding vast, the wit beyond measure that her own epitaph had promised. A thing that could make a failing mind whole. A thing that could make a whole mind more than any mind had ever been. It had been lost for centuries, mourned as destroyed, and Holloway had spent the last and most frightened decade of his life proving the mourning wrong, tracing it through 300 years of guardians who had hidden it and lied about its destruction precisely so that men like him would stop looking, tracing it down a thinning line of keepers to a single old woman on the edge of the northern sea, the last of them, who had to die before the thing she sat on could move. And she had died. And Mortlake the finder, the cold gray instrument Holloway had hired because Mortlake wanted nothing and so could not be turned, had found the thread and run it south and now stood, by his last report, within arm's reach of the prize. Holloway sat among his stopping clocks and made himself hold that fact still in the failing house of his mind, gripping it the way a falling man grips a root. It is close, it is found, there is still time. He did not let himself think the other thought, the one that waited at the bottom of every silence now, that the curse was faster than the finder, that the diadem might reach his hands a week, a day, an hour after there was no longer anyone inside his head left to wear it. He had told Mortlake at the door in the one moment of naked truth he had permitted himself, before there is no one left in here to wear it. He meant it as a deadline, he knew it for a prayer. And he sat in the cold with his 3 stopped clocks and his 90 running ones, all of them wrong, none of them agreeing, and he waited for a gray man to bring him back his own mind in a band of silver. And he had decided with the last clear and ruthless part of himself that whoever currently held that silver, keeper, thief, child, it did not matter, could not be allowed to matter, would simply have to be persuaded to give it up, or made to, or removed. He had killed before in his long, dangerous prime. He found, examining himself in the cold, that the failing of his mind had not touched that capacity at all. It was almost the last thing left intact. He thought perhaps that it would be enough. Mortlake came to Little Winging in the last week of April, and came as no one, which was the only way he ever came anywhere. He arrived by the slow, ordinary means, on foot from the station with a traveler's bag, a narrow gray man whom the eye slid off, and he took a room above a shop and spent 2 days simply being in the town, walking it, learning it, letting it grow used to the sight of him until he was a fixture no one would later be able to describe. He did not go near the library on the first day or the second. He had not survived 30 years in his trade by arriving eager. On the 3rd day, when the town had stopped seeing him, he went in through the green door that stuck and gave, and found a tall, stooping woman with an ink stain on her cuff cataloging behind the desk, and he asked her, in the mild voice of a mild man, whether she might have any old foreign books for sale, as he was a collector of curiosities and had heard a parish library sometimes had such things tucked away. Miss Pelham, who had no reason on earth to suspect the Heron-still man in gray, told him the truth, because the truth was harmless and the man was pleasant, and there was no card in any catalog that warned a librarian which of her visitors had buried a man's memory over a cup of tea. Yes, she said, as it happened, there were some old books, foreign ones, that had come to them in a bequest and that no one local could read. A dead lady's library from up north. They were in the back. She'd been meaning to do something with them for months. Was he interested? He was very interested. She took him through to the storeroom, and Mortlake stood among the metal shelves in the dust and the radiator heat and looked at a low run of dark, heavy books, and his face did not change, because his face had been trained out of changing a long time ago, but the cold, still center of him went very quiet, the way a hunter goes quiet at the edge of a clearing where the quarry has been. He knew that wait. He took one down and another and turned the pages with the unhurried hands of a collector and read enough of them to be certain. These were Crew's, the Guardian's library 400 miles south, sitting on a parish shelf exactly as the ledger had promised. He had run the thread to its end. The thing he had hunted 19 years was within his reach here in this dusty room, and all that remained was to find which box, which oddment, which worthless-seeming thing among the worthless things the Guardian had hidden it inside, and then he found the hat box, pushed under the bottom shelf in a carton marked sundry, and he opened it, and it was empty, and the cold, still center of him went, for the second time in a year, very slightly more still. Not empty of everything. The carton held a dead life's leavings, spectacles and a stopped watch and a chipped cup, and a bundle of letters that he read in a single sweep of his eye and set aside as unimportant. But the hat box, the round hat box that had so clearly been made to hold a single precious round thing, the hat box that a guardian would have used to hide exactly the kind of object he had come 400 miles to find, the hat box was empty, and the dust inside it was disturbed, and the disturbance was recent and small, the size of a child's hands. Mortlake stood very still in the dusty light and assembled it the way he assembled everything, coldly, completely. The object had been here. It had come south in this carton, in this hat box, and it had been removed, not by the librarian who had just walked him to it without a flicker, who plainly believed the carton held nothing but rubbish, not by a dealer or a thief, who would have taken the whole carton or rifled it for the obvious valuables and left no such delicate small disturbance behind. It had been taken by someone with access to this room, someone careless enough to leave the box behind and careful enough to take only the one thing, someone with small hands. He turned, and his cold eye went to the duster hanging on its hook child height, and to the worn patch on the cold floor where someone small had clearly sat more than once among the books. He went back out to the desk, and he asked Miss Pelham mildly as a collector might, whether anyone else ever came to look at her old foreign books, a fellow enthusiast perhaps, he did so rarely meet another. And Miss Pelham, with no reason to lie and every reason to be charmed, smiled and said, well, it was funny he should ask, there was a boy. A queer solemn little boy who couldn't read a word of them, of course, but liked to come on Friday afternoons and dust the shelf and look at the pretty writing, the circles and the stars. Been coming since the autumn. Left her a note the very first time, the cheeky thing, before he'd even a card she had it still somewhere. She kept the odd ones, and Mortlake, who had not let a flicker reach his face in 20 years, said how charming and what a curious child, and did the boy have a name. And Miss Pelham, reaching for the drawer where she kept the borrower cards, the drawer with a card in it written in a neat hand a year ago, the card that said Harry Potter, paused with her fingers on the handle, because the pleasant gray gentleman was looking at her now in a way she could not quite, in a way that made her, for no reason she could name, want very much to remember an appointment she did not have. Knowing that a hunter would come, Harry stopped waiting to be found and began, coldly and methodically, to prepare to be found. It was the difference he had read in the Green Book between seeming and being, and he applied it now to his own safety. A boy who merely hid was a boy who lost the moment he was discovered, because all his strength was in the hiding and none of it in what came after. Harry did not intend to lose the moment he was discovered. So through that spring he built, behind the dull face and the gray careful marks, not only a wall but a fortress, a thing with more than one room and more than one door and more than one answer ready for whoever came knocking. He deepened the shield in his mind past anything the cruel book had imagined, until he could hold 3 faces ready at once. The empty gray antechamber for a casual reader, a second false country behind it stocked with exactly the boring miseries a beaten orphan ought to have, and behind that, walled and silent and his, the true country no working he had yet read could reach. He practiced moving between them until the moving was instant and unconscious, until a reader entering his mind would walk through room after convincing room of nothing and come away certain he had seen the whole. He moved the silver, too. Not far, he had nowhere far to move it, but he stopped trusting the single loose board, because a single hiding place was a single point of failure, and the dead woman's letters had taught him what happened to guardians who grew careless. He made 2 more caches and a decoy, and he learned the streets and gardens and rooftops of Little Winging the way a general learns ground, every alley and fence gap and blind corner, so that whatever happened, wherever it happened, he would be the one who knew the board and the other the one who guessed. He was 7 years old, and he was preparing, in the spare gray hours of a neglected child's life, for a confrontation with a killer he had never met, and he did it without fear, or rather with the fear folded down small and put to use, because the silver had taught him that fear was only information about danger, and that information was the one thing he never threw away. And he made himself a promise in the dark, with the silver cool on his brow, the same way he had set the rule of concealment on the very first night. He would not be a victim of this. He would not be a frightened child whose treasure was taken by a stronger hand, the way every treasure in his life had been taken. The dead woman had written they always come, and she had written it as a defeat, as the weary certainty of a guardian who knew the hunters would outlast her line. Harry read it differently. If they always came, then he need not chase them. They would deliver themselves to him in their own time, hungry and certain, and underestimating the small, dull boy they had run to ground. And when one of them did, Harry intended to be the most thoroughly prepared 7-year-old that the world behind the world had ever failed to notice. He would choose the ground. He would choose the terms. He would let the hunter believe, right up to the last possible moment, that he had cornered a child, and then he would show him precisely and completely and only once, exactly what kind of mind a dead queen had chosen to crown. It was not a child's plan. He had stopped being a child in any way that mattered on a night in a cupboard with a band of silver on his brow, and the world simply had not noticed yet, and the not noticing was the deadliest weapon he owned. He was as ready as a year of secret nights could make him. He did not know it would be tested that very Friday. But when he stood on the gray pavement 20 feet from the green door and felt the still cold attention waiting on the other side of it, the readiness was already in him, laid down strand by strand over a lonely year, and it did not break and it did not run. It simply quietly began to plan. Harry came to the library that Friday at his usual hour, and knew before he reached the green door that something was wrong. He had been learning all that lonely year to feel the shape of attention, the protective watcher in the cats, the kindly catch of Mr. Whitby's eye, the weather of every mind around him. And the shape of the attention near the library that afternoon was a shape he had never felt before, and it stopped him on the pavement 20 feet from the door as surely as a hand on his chest. It was still, that was the wrongness of it. Every watcher he had ever felt had a warmth or a worry in it, a human texture. This had none. This was the attention of a thing that had no warmth and wanted only one thing and had been waiting. The letter's phrase rose unbidden in his perfect memory. They always come, a long, long time. It was coming from inside the library. It was pointed, Harry understood with a cold that went all the way down, not at the books and not at Miss Pelham, but along a thread that ran from a card in a drawer to a name to a boy, and the boy was him. He did not go in. He stood on the pavement in the gray April light, a small, undersized child in an enormous jumper, and through the green door he could feel a narrow gray stillness asking quiet questions of the kindest person in his daylight world, and he understood completely all at once, the way he understood everything now, that the warning in the dead woman's letters had stopped being a story. They always came. One of them had come. It was 20 feet away on the other side of a door that stuck and gave, and it did not yet have his face, but it had his name, and it was patient, and it was not going to leave. Harry turned unhurried, a dull boy who had changed his mind about the library, and walked away down the gray street at exactly the pace of a child with nowhere to be, and behind the wall he had built in the dark over a long and lonely year, the smartest mind in England began, very calmly, to plan. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The Diadem's history. He went back for the books that same night, because the hunter would go back for them in the morning, and whichever of them held the dead woman's writings would hold the truth, and Harry had decided a year ago that the truth was a thing he no longer let other people keep. He waited until the house was deep asleep, and then he left it, which he had never done before, easing the cupboard door and the back door and slipping out into the cool dark of the small hours. The streets were empty under the orange lamps, and the protective watcher in the cats was a thing he had learned to walk softly past, taking the gardens and the alleys he had spent the spring learning, a small shadow moving through a sleeping town toward a library that stuck and gave. He did not fear the dark. The dark was where he was most himself. The green door was locked, of course, and Harry stood before it and did the thing the severe old grammar had taught him, which was to understand a lock so completely that it forgot to be locked, not forcing it, which left marks, but persuading the simple mechanism that its tongue had always been drawn back, and the door, which had stuck on 1,000 wet afternoons, gave for him in perfect silence. Inside the library was a country of shapes in the dark, the shelves great sleeping animals, and Harry made his small cold light cupped close in his palm and went through to the storeroom, and felt, the moment he crossed the threshold, the residue of the hunter on the air. It was faint and it was cold and it was unmistakable, the trace of a stillness that had stood in this room and turned these pages with patient, knowing hands, and Harry stood in it and read it the way he read everything. The hunter had been here. The hunter had handled the books and found them and known them for what they were, and Harry went to the carton marked sundry and crouched over it. The hunter had read the bundle of letters in a single sweep and set them back, judging them unimportant, which told Harry something useful about the hunter. That he was looking for the object and not the history, that he wanted the silver and did not care how it had come to be, and that a man who did not care about the history could be beaten by a boy who did. Harry took the letters. He took from the low run of shelving the books that mattered most, the grammar and the green book of change and 2 others he had marked in his memory across the long autumn, as many as he could carry in the canvas bag and against his belly under his shirt. And then at the very bottom of the sundry carton, beneath the spectacles and the stopped watch and the chipped cup with its faded rabbit, in a hollow he had never thought to search because he had always been interrupted by the closing of the library, his cold light found a thing the hunter's single contemptuous sweep had missed. A notebook, small, black, swollen with age and use, its cover worn to softness by a hand that had held it for 60 years. It was wrapped as the silver had been wrapped, in a scrap of the same moth-eaten shawl, hidden as the silver had been hidden, among worthless things where only a patient eye would find it, and the hunter, who wanted the object and not the history, had swept the carton for the object, found only oddments, and gone, leaving behind, unread, the one thing in all the world that told what the object truly was. Harry lifted it out and held it in his small cold light, and felt the weight of it, lighter than the silver and heavier than any book, and knew before he opened it that he held the history he had come for, and more than the history, because the trace of the dead woman was in it the way the trace of the hunter was in the room, and hers was warm. He put it against his belly with the books, and he closed the carton, and he stood a moment in the residue of the hunter and let himself feel the size of what he had just done, walked into a room the hunter had claimed in the dark, alone at 7 years old, and walked out with the heart of the thing while the hunter slept 2 streets away, certain he had already won. Harry did not smile, even alone, even there. But something in him stood a little straighter as he slipped back out through the door that locked itself behind him, and went home through the sleeping town with 300 years of secrets warm against his skin. The walk home was the dangerous part, and Harry had known it would be, because a boy can explain himself in a library at midnight to no one but a hunter, and there were softer eyes than the hunter's awake and little winging that night. He came out of the alley behind the parade of shops with the canvas bag heavy against his hip and the notebook warm against his belly, and he had gone no more than a street before he felt it, the protective watcher, stirring. A cat fell into step with him along the top of a garden wall, the tabby from the gatepost, pacing him at shoulder height with its flat yellow attention fixed and unblinking, and Harry understood that he was being seen, and by whom, and that a small boy abroad at 1 in the morning with a bag of stolen books was exactly the kind of anomaly the watcher had been set there to catch. A light came on 2 streets over in the upstairs window of the house where the old woman lived among her cats, a yellow square waking in the dark, and Harry felt the attention behind it sharpened toward him like a turning eye. He did not run. Running was an answer, and an answer was information, and he gave the watcher none. He made himself instead into the most boring possible explanation of himself, the way he made himself boring for Mr. Whitby and the Dursleys and the whole grey daylight world, a sleepwalking child, perhaps, or a wretched boy locked out and wandering, miserable and ordinary and not worth waking the street for. He let his shoulders slump, he let his feet drag. He turned not toward number 4, which would have drawn the eye straight to his door, but down a side road, the wrong road, the road of a boy with nowhere in particular to be, and he walked it slow and stooped and hopeless until the upstairs light, after a long watching minute, went out, and the cat, after a longer one, lost interest in a thing so plainly going nowhere, and dropped off the wall and was gone about its own dark business. Only then did Harry double back by the gardens, by the fence gaps he had spent the spring learning, and let himself in through the cupboard window latch he had long since taught to open for him, and folded himself back into the dark under the stairs with 300 years of secrets intact against his skin. He lay in the warded silence and felt the strange shape of his own life settle over him again, stranger tonight than ever. He had just hidden in the space of a single hour from both the people who wanted to hurt him and the people who wanted to keep him safe, and he had hidden from them with the same craft, the same dull boring nothing to see here, because the terrible truth at the center of his life was that the silver made no distinction between them, and neither, in the end, could he. The hunter would take the diadem to feed a dying man's greed. The guardians would take it for his own protection, gently, certain they were right, and hand him back to his cupboard a safe ordinary boy with the best thing that had ever happened to him confiscated for his own good. Both would end the same way. Both would end with the silver in someone else's hands and Harry Potter made small again. And so he hid from both with the same cold care, and the hiding from the kind ones was the heavier weight by far, because the hunter he could in time defeat, but the guardians he could only ever evade forever, a boy keeping a secret from the very people who had warded his house and watched his door because they alone in all the world had decided he mattered. He did not resent them for it. He understood them too well to resent them. That was the curse of the silver, that it left him no one to blame. He only knew that he was, in the deepest and most permanent way, on his own, more on his own than the dead woman in the notebook had been, because she had at least been hidden from a world that did not know she existed, and Harry was hidden in plain sight from a world that thought it knew exactly who he was. He turned the loneliness over once, the way he turned everything over, and found in it tonight, beside the old ache, a new and harder thing, the cold satisfaction of a guardian who has slipped every watcher on the board, kind and cruel alike, and brought the treasure home. He had kept it safe. Tonight, that was enough. He let himself sleep. He read the notebook over the nights that followed, with the silver cool on his brow and the small cold light in his palm, and what he read remade his understanding of the thing he carried and of himself. It was written in 2 hands across 60 years, the spidery hand of the boxes for the recent entries, and beneath and before it an older hand, and beneath that an older still, generation copied into generation, each keeper adding to the book and recopying what was fading, so that the notebook was not one woman's record but a chain of them, a single long conversation across centuries between the dead and the not yet born. And the conversation began, the oldest copied-over pages said, with a woman who had been the wisest of an age, and who had been afraid of one thing only, which was the death of the mind. Her name was set down plainly, and Harry read it and felt the floor of the world tilt as it had tilted in the storeroom over the screaming root, Rowena. Rowena, who with 3 others had raised a school in the north 1,000 years gone, and who had been, even among those founders, the one the others came to when they did not understand, the keeper of the deepest learning of her time. She had loved knowledge the way other people loved gold or God or other people, totally as the meaning of her life, and she had watched, across a long, brilliant span of years, the things she most feared begin to happen to her. She had begun to forget. Not as Holloway forgot, by a curse, but as everyone forgets, by being mortal, the slow leak of a lifetime's understanding out of a vessel that was wearing thin. And it had seemed to her, the notebook said, an obscenity past bearing, that a person could spend 70 years learning how to think, could climb by labor and grief to the very summit of understanding, and then simply die and take the whole of it into the dark, so that every child born after had to begin again at the bottom, in ignorance, as if the climbing had never been done. Books could hold facts. Books could not hold the way of thinking that made facts into wisdom. That died with the mind that made it, always, every time, and Rowena had decided in the proud grief of her age that she would not let it die with hers. So she made the diadem. The notebook was careful here, careful in the way of keepers who had guarded a dangerous truth for centuries, and Harry read the careful pages 3 times each. She had not put herself into it. That was the thing the chain of keepers had set down most insistently, generation after generation, as though warning against a confusion they knew the world would make. The diadem was not a tomb for a soul, not a ghost in silver, not the dead woman's will reaching out of the metal to seize the living. There were such things in the world, the notebook said in a hand that shuddered to write it, foul makings in which a person tore their own soul to cheat death and bound the torn piece into an object. And the things so made were corruptions, hungry and cold and evil, and the rumor that would one day attach itself to the diadem, that it was such a thing, a vessel of some dark soul, a horror to be destroyed. That rumor was a lie, and the keepers had helped to spread it on purpose. Because a thing men believe to be an evil horror is a thing men leave alone. The truth was the opposite of the rumor, and the keepers had hidden the truth inside the rumor the way they hid the silver inside the worthless things. The truth was that Rowena had bound into the silver not a soul but a method. The distilled discipline of a lifetime's learning, not what she knew, but how she had come to know it, not her memories, but the ways of attention and patience and ruthless honest thought by which a mind turned the world into understanding. She had spent her last years pouring it into moonstone and silver, the way a master pours a lifetime's skill into the teaching of a single apprentice, except that the apprentice was the thing itself, and the thing would not die and would not forget, and would stand ready across the centuries to take the next worthy mind that wore it and do for that mind what no book and no teacher could do. Hand it entire, the accumulated art of thinking that had taken the wisest woman of an age her whole life to build. Wit beyond measure, not given, taught. The silver did not make a fool wise, it could not. It only ever made a thinking mind the best version of itself and stood at the shoulder of the worthy and showed them how to think, exactly as it had shown Harry on the first night in the dark without a single word. He sat with that a long time, the small cold light steady over his open hand, and felt the loneliness in him eased by some measure it had not eased in a year. He was not the freakish accident he had half believed himself, a boy who had stumbled into a power too large for him. He was the thing the silver had been made 1,000 years ago to find, a mind that wanted to understand more than it wanted anything, that would climb by labor toward the summit Rowena had reached, and that needed only to do it, the one thing she had found a way to give across the gulf of her own death, her method, her shoulder, her patient wordless here is how. She had made it for him. Not for him by name, she had never heard his name, would be 1,000 years dust before he was born, but for him by kind. She had reached out of her own ending and made a thing to find the next mind like hers, and across 10 centuries and 400 miles and the whole vast indifference of the world. The thing had found him in a cupboard hiding from his cousin and had chosen him, and Harry understood at last that the choosing was the warmest thing that had ever happened to him, warmer than Mr. Whitby's chalk-dusted kindness, warmer than Miss Pelham's silence. Because it was the only love in his life that had come looking for him on purpose. It was the chain of keepers that explained the choosing, and the rule beneath it, and the rule was the thing Harry committed to memory most carefully of all, because he understood, reading it, that it might one day be the only weapon that could save his life. Rowena had not given the diadem to the school. She had not given it to her fellow founders, brilliant and ambitious as they were, because she had seen what ambition did to brilliance, and she had not trusted even her friends with a thing that could make a great mind greater. She had given it a guardian and bound into it a law, and the law was this. The diadem judged its wearer and gave only to the worthy, and the worthy were not the powerful or the clever or the strong, but the ones who came to knowledge humbly, who wanted to understand and not to command, who loved the climbing more than the height. To such a mind the silver opened the clear room. And to any other mind, to the grasping mind that wanted wisdom as a tool, the hungry mind that wanted it as a possession, the frightened mind that wanted it only to stop being afraid, to any mind that came to it wanting power instead of understanding, the silver gave nothing. Worse than nothing. The notebook set it down in the gravest hand in all its pages, a warning copied forward by keeper after keeper who had seen, across the centuries, what became of those who tried to take by force a thing that could only be received by grace. The vessel of wisdom could not be commanded by the unwise, and when an unworthy mind put on the diadem and demanded what it had no right to receive, the diadem answered the demand with the whole weight of the wit beyond measure it carried, and the unworthy mind, unable to hold what it had seized, unable even to understand what was being poured into it, broke under the pouring. It was not a curse. The keepers were careful to say so. It was only the nature of the thing, the way the sea is not cruel to the man who cannot swim. Wisdom forced into a mind that wanted only power did to that mind what the ocean does to lungs that try to breathe it. The unworthy did not gain the wit beyond measure, they drowned in it. Harry read that 3 times and then a fourth, and behind the wall in the bright country no one could enter. The cold, clear part of him that the silver had woken recognized it at once for a weapon, and understood that the dead woman 1,000 years gone had built, into the very thing the hunters wanted, the exact mechanism of their undoing. A worthy mind need only let an unworthy one reach for the prize. The prize would do the rest. He did not yet know how he would use it. He knew only that he had found in a dead queen's notebook the shape of the trap that would end the hunt, and that the trap had been waiting 1,000 years for a guardian clever enough to spring it, and that he was, by the silver's own choosing, that guardian. The rest of the chain the notebook told more quickly, because the keepers had been plain people living quiet lives, and there was less to say of them than of the woman who began it. The first guardian had been one who loved Rowena and feared what the world would do to her last and greatest making. The notebook named her only as the daughter, and Harry, who had read the dry almanac's legends, understood that the world remembered this daughter as a thief who stole her mother's diadem and lost it and was lost herself. The truth in the notebook was kinder and colder both. The daughter had not stolen it. She had carried it away to save it, when it became plain that the powerful of her age had begun to covet it, and she had spread, with her own grieving mouth, the tale of her theft and her flight and the diadem's loss, so that the covetous would chase a story into the wild places and leave the true thing hidden. She had paid for the saving with her life and her good name, remembered forever as a thief, and she had counted the price worth paying, and she had passed the keeping before the end to hands that would hide it better than fame ever could, to plain hands, quiet hands, the hands of people the world would never think to watch. And so it had gone down 10 centuries, the relic hidden among the worthless belongings of unremarkable people, passed mother to daughter, keeper to keeper, each one spreading a little further the comfortable lie that the diadem was lost or destroyed, each one living and dying without glory, guarding in obscurity the wisest thing the world had ever made, until the line thinned. Until it came down to a single old woman on the edge of the northern sea, the last of the daughters of the daughter who had no daughter of her own, and who had grown too old to find the next pair of hands while the hands were young, and who had died at last with the keeping ungiven and the warning unheeded, certain she had failed. She had not failed. Harry understood that now, and wished with a sharpness that surprised him that he could tell her so. She had hidden the silver among her worthless things exactly as her mothers had taught her, where only a worthy eye would find it, and a worthy eye had found it, the worthiest the silver had met in 1,000 years, hiding from a fat boy in the back of a library, and the relic had done the last thing she had not lived to do, which was to choose its own next keeper, the moment a small, unwanted mind that wanted only to understand had looked into a hat box and seen. Where every other eye saw costume jewelry, the brightest thing in the world. Mortlake returned to the library when it opened on Saturday morning, unhurried, a mild collector come to make an offer on some old foreign books, and found the carton picked clean and new in the cold still center of him, that the child had beaten him to it in the night. He did not show it. He stood in the storeroom and let the librarian chatter, and he read the room the way he read everything. The low run of dark heavy books was thinned, 4 of the best gone, the ones a knowing eye would take first, which told him the eye that took them had been knowing. The carton marked sundry had been opened and closed again, neatly, by hands that knew what they were doing and wished it not to show. And on the dust of the floor, over the worn child-height patch where someone small had sat all autumn, there were fresh small prints, and the storeroom door's simple lock, when he bent to it, had been opened without a key and without a mark, persuaded rather than forced, which no muggle child could have done and no ordinary thief would have troubled to. Mortlake crouched in the dust a long moment, reading the prints, and felt something he had not felt in 19 years, a thing his trade had nearly trained out of him entirely, which was surprise. The child was not a child who had blundered onto a tiara and carried it off as a bright toy. The child had come back in the dark alone, the very night a hunter arrived, and had emptied the room of everything that mattered with a craft that left almost no trace, as though the child had known a hunter was coming and had moved first. He stood and brushed the dust from his good gray knees and went out to the desk and asked the librarian mildly for the name on the card. What happened next Mortlake would consider afterward with the cold detachment he brought to his own failures, which were rare enough to be worth studying. He had taken 100 memories from 100 soft muggle minds, gently, a card lifted from the middle of a stacked deck, and not once in 30 years had the deck noticed. He reached into Miss Pelham for the boy's name and the boy's face and the boy's address, the small harvest he needed, and he would turn this over for days. He met a thing he had not put there. The librarian's mind gave up the name readily enough. Harry Potter, it said, the queer solemn little boy, comes Fridays, dusts the shelf. But around the name, around the face, lay a warmth that resisted him. the plain stubborn fondness of a lonely woman for a lonely child, and it did not want to give the boy up, and in the giving it cried out in the wordless way a guarded mind cries out, so that some part of Pelham felt the cold hand in her thoughts and went pale and gripped the edge of the desk and said, in a voice gone suddenly faint, that she felt unwell, that the gentleman must excuse her. That she could not think why she had come over so queer. Mortlake withdrew smoothly, leaving her the small mercy of believing it a faintness, and he had what he had come for, a name, a face, a town he already stood in, but he went out through the door that stuck with the unfamiliar sense of having been, very slightly, resisted, and of having left, very slightly, a mark. It did not matter, he told himself, walking the grey morning streets. The librarian was nothing, a soft muggle who would shake off her queer turn by lunchtime and remember only a pleasant collector who had asked after a child. What mattered was the name, and the name was a small undersized boy in an enormous jumper who had emptied a hunter's prize from under his nose in the dark, and Mortlake, who did not care what the object was, found that he had begun, against 30 years of discipline, to care a little what the child was. A guardian, perhaps. The relic chose its keepers, the oldest rumors said. Perhaps it had chosen this one, plucked a clever orphan out of a cupboard and made him cleverer, set him to guard the thing the way the dead woman had guarded it. It changed nothing. A guardian was only a lock, and Mortlake opened locks. But he revised, walking, his estimate of the work ahead, and he resolved to be more careful than he had meant to be, because a lock that moves first is a lock that has a mind, and a lock with a mind could not simply be picked. It had to be outthought. Mortlake had outthought clever things than a 7-year-old. He turned toward the telephone box from which he made the calls his client could not know the number of, to report that he had a name and a face and would have the object within the week, and he did not let himself wonder yet whether the week would be enough. In the cold house full of clocks, Holloway received the report standing, which he had not done in a year, gripping the back of his high chair with both hands as though the news might be taken from him if he let go. A name, a face, a child. The gray man's voice came thin down the line that did not officially exist, mild and certain, within the week, and Holloway held the words against the failing house of his mind and felt, for the first time in longer than he could now reliably remember, something that was almost hope. Within the week, he had only to last the week. He turned from the telephone and looked at his clocks, his 90 running clocks and his 5-stop ones. 5 now. 2 more had died since the finder's last visit, their hands fallen, no one left to wind them, and he made himself do the arithmetic of his own dissolution, which was the cruelest arithmetic there was, because he had to do it with the very instrument it was destroying. How much of him was left, how fast the rest was going. Whether there would be a mind behind his eyes in a week, capable of putting on a band of silver and receiving what it gave, he did not know. The not knowing was the curse's finest cruelty. It ate the very faculty that might have measured the eating. He had begun in the last month to find notes in his own hand that he did not remember writing, instructions to himself, wind the clocks. The finder is called Mortlake. The thing is a diadem, you are looking for a diadem. Do not forget what you are looking for, and the morning he had found that last note and not, for one whole terrible minute, understood it, was the morning he had stopped sleeping. He sat back down slowly and let the clear, ruthless part of him, the part that was somehow the last to go, do its cold work. The finder said a week. The finder was patient, and patience was a luxury Holloway no longer owned, because the finder was racing a child, and Holloway was racing something faster and more final than any child. If the curse reached the end of him before the silver did, then everything, the fortune, the years, the finder, the whole desperate machinery of his hope, would have bought nothing, a cure delivered to a corpse, wisdom poured into a vessel already shattered. He could not allow the finder's caution to cost him the only days he had left. He would go himself. The decision settled into him with the cold finality of all his old decisions, the ones that had made his name a hush in the narrow world. He would go to the town where the child was, and he would not wait for the finder's careful week. And if a small, undersized boy stood between Lucian Holloway and the last chance his dying mind would ever have, then the boy would give up the silver or be made to or be removed, and Holloway found, examining the prospect in the cold, that the failing of everything else in him had left that capacity untouched and even sharpened, the way a house being emptied leaves the one heavy thing in the middle of the bare floor. He had been in his prime, a man other men were right to fear. He was dying, he was not dead, and a dying predator he knew was the most dangerous kind there was, because it had nothing left to lose and very little time to lose it in. He wrote himself a note in a hand that shook only a little. Go south. The child has it. Take it back before there is no one left to wear it. He read it twice to be sure he would understand it when he found it, and he put it in his breast pocket where his hand would find it even when his mind could not, and he began, among his stopping clocks, to prepare to leave the cold house for the last time. Harry came to the end of the notebook on the third night, and the end of it was a letter, and the letter was to him. Not to him by name, she had never known his name. But the last entry, in the spidery hand gone shaky at the close, was written plainly to whoever should come after, to the one the lady chooses when I am gone, and Harry read it with the silver cool on his brow and the small cold light steady over the page. And it was the nearest thing to being spoken to by someone who loved him that he had ever had, and he let himself have it in the dark where no one could see. If you are reading this, the dead woman had written, then it has chosen you, and you have found your way to my book, which means you are clever enough and patient enough to be what it needs, and I am glad and I am sorry. Glad because the line did not end with me after all, and the silver did the last thing I had no daughter to do, and found you. Sorry because I know what I am handing you, and it is heavy, and you are likely young, for it loves the young who love to learn, and no one young should have to carry this alone. But you will be alone. That is the first thing I must tell you, and the hardest. The keeping cannot be shared. The moment another soul knows what you hold, they become either a hunter or a victim, and you will have made them so, and you will not be able to unmake it. I learned this young, and I have been alone 80 years, and I will not pretend to you that it does not cost. It costs everything. It is worth it. Both of those are true, and you must hold them both, the way you must hold so many things at once now. The second thing is the warning, and you must believe it though it will seem to you in your safe young life like a tale. They always come. There has not been a guardian in 1,000 years who was not, in the end, hunted for what she held. The powerful learn the silver is not lost, the dying learn it can make a mind whole, the ambitious learn it can make a great mind greater, and one by one down all the centuries they come, and they do not ask, and they do not stop. You will think, reading this in your quiet, that you have time. You do not have as much as you think. By the time you understand the warning, the one who is coming for you has very likely already begun to come. Do not wait to be found. Find them first in your mind if nowhere else. Know the ground. Know the rule. You will have read the rule by now, the rule of the worthy and the unworthy. And I tell you, it is not only the silver's law but your shield and your sword, the one weapon you have that they will never see, because they cannot imagine that the thing they hunger for is the thing that will undo them. Let it undo them. Do not throw your life away fighting strength with strength. You will lose. You are a guardian, not a soldier. Guard cleverly. Let the silver guard itself as it was made to, and stand only where you must. And the last thing, the only thing I have to give you that is mine and not the lady's, it is worth keeping. I know that you will doubt it in the lonely middle of some night when the cost of it is on you and the warmth of it feels far away. I doubted it. Every keeper doubts it. But we kept it, all of us, down 1,000 years, plain women in quiet houses, because we understood what we were guarding, not a treasure, not a weapon, but the wisdom of the wisest mind the world has made, held safe against the death of every mind that holds it, waiting for the next one worthy to receive it. That is a thing worth a lonely life. It was worth mine. I hope, whoever you are, that it will be worth yours, and that you will be less alone than I was, and that when your time comes you will find, sooner than I did, the young hands to give it to. Keep it well. Keep yourself well. They are coming. You are ready, or the silver would not have chosen you. A.C. Harry read it once, and then he sat in the dark for a long time and did not read anything at all, which was rare for him. The light burned cold and steady over the closed notebook. Behind the wall in the bright country, the wonder and the loneliness and the cold clear planning all stood quiet for a while, and what stood among them new was a thing he had not had a name for until a dead woman handed it to him across her own grave. He was a guardian, not a freak, not an accident, not a frightened boy hoarding a stolen toy. The last of a line 1,000 years long, chosen by the thing itself, worn by every keeper who had carried it before him, and entrusted. That was the word, entrusted. No one had ever entrusted Harry Potter with anything, entrusted with the wisest making in the world. They are coming. You are ready. He thought of the still cold attention behind the green door. He thought of the residue of the hunter in the storeroom, the patient knowing hands. By the time you understand the warning, the one who is coming for you has very likely already begun to come. She had been right about everything else. She was right about this. One of them had already come. And Harry Potter, 7 years old, the last guardian and the smartest mind in Britain, closed the dead woman's notebook in the dark under the stairs, and was not afraid, because being afraid was only information about danger. And he had all the information now, and what he had instead of fear was a thing far colder and far steadier and far more dangerous to the people coming for him. He had begun, completely and without mercy, to plan. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Hunted for it. Mortlake watched the boy for 3 days before he tried his mind, because a careful hunter learns the ground before he sets foot on it, and the ground in this case was a child. He watched from the places the eye slid off: a bus shelter, a parked car, a bench at the edge of the playing field, and what he watched troubled him more each day, in the small, precise way that things troubled a man who had trained himself out of larger feelings. The boy was nothing. That was the trouble. Mortlake had taken the measure of 1,000 people in his trade, and the measure of Harry Potter came back again and again as a flat gray nothing. An undersized child in a jumper 4 sizes too big, who shuffled to a dismal school and shuffled home, who flinched from a fat cousin and a thick-necked uncle, who kept his eyes down and his voice flat and gave the watching world precisely nothing to watch. A guardian of the wisest making in the world ought to glow, Mortlake thought, ought to carry himself with some weight of what he held. This one carried himself like a thing that wished to be a stain on a wall, and it was the very perfection of the nothing that began on the third day to trouble Mortlake most, because in 30 years he had met that perfect and nothing only in people who were hiding something with great skill, and he had never met it at all in a child. So on the fourth day he tried the boy's mind in passing on the pavement outside the school, the way he had tried 100 minds, a glance, a reaching, a card lifted from the deck. The boy came out in the straggle of children at the end of the day, and Mortlake, leaning gray and unremarkable against a lamp post with a folded newspaper, caught the small one's eye for half a second across the road and reached in, and found a room. It was a small gray room, the inside of an ordinary unhappy child, and Mortlake moved through it in the half-second the contact lasted and read its contents with the speed of long practice. Misery, hunger, the dull resentments of a beaten boy, a cupboard, a cousin's fist, the gray arithmetic of a wretched life. It was complete, it was convincing. It was exactly, precisely, the mind a boy like that ought to have, and Mortlake had withdrawn from it and was already cataloguing it as nothing when the cold still center of him, the part that had kept him alive 30 years, said, too complete. He had been in 1,000 real minds, and real minds were not rooms, they were weather chaos, 100 thoughts at once, the present moment roaring over the past. This had been a room, furnished, arranged. A still life of a wretched childhood, laid out for a visitor to find, with not one thought roaring in it, not one flicker of the boy's actual now, no awareness of the man across the road, no curiosity, no fear, nothing live at all. He had not read a child's mind. He had read a display of a child's mind, built and dressed and left lit in the front window, and the boy who built it was somewhere behind it, in a dark Mortlake had not been allowed to enter, watching him look. Mortlake stood very still against the lamp post and did not let it reach his face, and across the road the small gray boy shuffled away with the other children, eyes down, giving the world nothing, and Mortlake understood, with a coldness that went all the way to the bottom of him, that he had just been deceived by a 7-year-old's occlumency. Walls of a craft he had seen bettered only by the oldest and most dangerous minds in the hidden world, raised impossibly. Behind the face of a child who flinched at a fat cousin's fist, the relic had not merely chosen this boy, it had remade him. And Mortlake, who did not care what the object was, found that for the second time in a single week he cared very much what the child was, and that the caring had an unfamiliar edge to it that he examined in the privacy of his stillness and identified with some surprise as the first cold touch of professional fear. Harry felt the hunter's mind come into his own like a cold hand laid flat against a window pane, and he did not flinch, because he had spent a year building the window for exactly this. He had known the man for what he was the moment he felt the still cold attention on the pavement, the same attention from behind the library's green door, given a body now, a narrow gray shape against a lamp post with a newspaper it was not reading. And when the reaching came, Harry did the thing he had practiced in the dark until it was faster than thought. He opened the front rooms and held the back ones shut. He gave the hunter the gray antechamber and the dress display behind it, the convincing still life of a wretched ordinary boy, and he held the true country walled and silent and dark, and he stood inside the dark and watched the cold hand move through the rooms he had built for it to find, and felt it pause, felt the man's mind catch for half a second on the very perfection of the lie, and then withdraw. It had worked. Not perfectly, the pause told Harry the man was good, better than the cruel book had imagined any but the rarest reader could be, that he had felt the wrongness even if he could not pass the wall. But it had held. The hunter had reached into the smartest mind in Britain and come away with exactly the nothing Harry had built for him, and the relic behind the loose board was as safe as it had been an hour ago, and Harry had not only defended. That was the thing the hunter would not learn until it was too late, the thing that separated a guardian from a victim. In the half-second the cold hand lay against his window, Harry had read the hand. A mind that reaches into yours leaves itself, for that instant, open to a mind quick enough to reach back, and Harry was quicker than anything the hunter had ever met. He did not break into the man, he had ruled out the breaking of minds, and a careful break would have shown. He only read what the contact itself betrayed, the way you read a stranger's profession from his hands, and in that half-second he learned a great deal. The man was a finder, a hired thing, cold and patient and without wants of his own, and so without wants he could not be turned or frightened or bought, which Harry noted as a difficulty. But behind the finder in the texture of his purpose, Harry felt the other one, the true one, the one whose money moved the gray hand. An old mind, vast and failing, surrounded. Harry caught the image the finder carried without knowing he carried it, surrounded by clocks, hundreds of clocks, all running, all wrong, a great cold house of stopped and stopping time, and a hunger in the old mind so total and so desperate that it dwarfed the finder's chill the way a furnace dwarfs a candle. The finder wanted to be paid. The one behind the finder wanted to live and would do anything, and was running out of the one thing his money could not buy, which was time. Harry walked home with his eyes down, giving the world nothing, and behind the wall the cold clear part of him laid the new intelligence beside the dead woman's warning and began, with a calm that would have frightened the men hunting him far more than any childish terror, to draw the map of his enemies. 2 of them. Patient instrument with no wants, and a desperate master with one want larger than the world. He understood already that he could not beat them the same way because they could not be beaten the same way, and he understood with the first cold stirring of the thing that was not quite a plan yet, that two enemies who wanted different things were two enemies who could be set by a clever enough guardian against each other. The dead woman had written it: do not throw your life away fighting strength with strength. You will lose. He did not intend to fight their strength at all. He intended to use it, all of it, the finder's patience and the master's hunger, and turn it, like a lever multiplying a small push into a large one, until it did to them what he could never do to them himself. He was 7 years old. He had been hunted for 4 days. And somewhere in the walk home, between the school gate and the cupboard, the hunt quietly and invisibly reversed, and the hunters did not know it yet, and that was the whole of the point. The first thing he did was protect Miss Pelham, because she was the soft place in his defenses, and the hunter had already touched her, and Harry would not let the only kindness in his daylight world be the price of his secret. He had felt it the moment he next passed the library, the residue of the cold hand on the librarian's mind, a bruise on the air where the hunter had reached into her for Harry's name and met. The warmth told him, her stubborn fondness, and hurt her getting past it. She had given him up without knowing she gave him up, and she had paid for it with a queer faint turn she would blame on her age, and she would pay more if the hunter, or the worst thing behind the hunter, decided she was a thread worth pulling again. Harry could not tell her. Telling her would make her a keeper of his secret, and a keeper of his secret was a hunter or a victim, and he had sworn on the first night that he would make no one either. So he protected her the only way a guardian could, which was from the outside, invisibly, at a cost she would never know to thank him for. He went to the library on the Friday, his usual hour, a dull boy come to dust, and while Miss Pelham worked at her desk he did 3 things she did not see. He laid around her as best a 7-year-old could lay a working on a grown woman without her feeling it, the faintest echo of the muffling charm he used on his cupboard, not a wall on her mind, which he would not build without her leave even to save her, but a kind of fog, a dullness over the memory of the queer collector and the boy who dusted, so that if the cold hand came again it would find her recollection of Harry already gone soft and gray, and not worth the taking. He moved the sundry carton, empty now of everything that mattered, to the front of the storeroom where she would find it, and he had arranged by a careful word, decide at last to send the worthless thing to the tip, so that when the hunter came looking again there would be nothing here at all, no books, no letters, no boy-shaped patch in the dust, no reason for the cold hand ever to touch the kind woman again. And he gave her, on his way out, a thing he had never given her, which was a lie meant to save her. He told her in his dull, flat voice that his family was moving away, that he wouldn't be coming Fridays anymore, that he'd wanted to say thank you for the books. He watched the small disappointment cross her tired face, and the small pleasure under it that the queer solemn child had bothered to say goodbye, and he made himself leave it there, one more kindness disguised as a dullness, because a Miss Pelham who believed the boy was gone was a Miss Pelham the hunters would stop watching, and a Miss Pelham they stopped watching was a Miss Pelham who lived. It cost him. She was the nearest thing to a friend he had, and he ended it on purpose with a lie to keep her safe from a danger she would never know had brushed her. He added it to the account of what the silver cost, the long cold ledger he kept and showed no one, and he walked out of the library for the last time and did not look back, because looking back was an answer, and he gave the watching world nothing, as always, as ever. Mortlake spent those same days doing what he always did before the end of a hunt, which was to sit very still and think, and the thinking, this time, would not come out the way he wanted it to. He had been hired to find a thing, and he had found it, and the finding was the part he loved and the part that was over. What remained was the taking, and the taking in 19 out of 20 hunts was a formality, a lock to open, a fear to apply, a memory to adjust, the soft mechanics by which a found thing changed hands. But this hunt was the 20th, and Mortlake, who had survived 30 years precisely by knowing the difference, made himself name the ways in which it was, coldly, one by one, in the dark of his rented room. The guardian was a child, which should have made the taking easier and made it instead impossibly hard, because a child could not be reasoned with or bought or made afraid in the ordinary adult ways, and because this particular child had emptied a guarded room in the dark the very night a hunter arrived, and had met a 30-year master's legilimency with a wall that gave back a furnished lie. He turned that over most of all. He had been deceived by minds before, by spies, by liars, by 2 or 3 people in his long career who had genuinely been his equals, and he had never once been deceived by a display so complete that he had catalogued it as nothing and walked half a street before the wrongness caught him. A child had done that. A child had built behind the face of a beaten orphan, a thing Mortlake had seen bettered only in the oldest and most dangerous heads in the hidden world, and the building of it meant the child was not merely guarding the relic but had been remade by it, sharpened into something that thought faster and saw further, and prepared more thoroughly than the grown man sent to rob him. and that was the calculation Mortlake could not make come out in his favor, however he ran it. A finder's whole art was asymmetry, to know more than his quarry, to move when the quarry did not expect it, to hold the one card the quarry had not counted. Against an ordinary guardian he held a dozen such cards. Against this one he could not be sure he held any, because a guardian who moved first, who emptied the room before the hunter woke, who built furnished lies behind a child's eyes, was a guardian who might already be holding cards Mortlake had not been dealt and could not see. He had felt it on the pavement, the half-second of contact, the sense of a dark behind the wall in which something quick and patient watched him look, and a professional who has felt himself watched from a place he cannot reach has, Mortlake knew, exactly one wise move remaining, which is to assume the watcher is his better and act accordingly. He had assumed many men his better over 30 years and lived where men who assumed otherwise had not. The assumption had never before cost him a fee this size. It had also never before been this clearly correct. He thought of his client, too, in the cold deliberation of those nights, the dying man in the good coat, the failing mind bright with want, the notes folded in the breast pocket, the curse running faster than any finder's week. A client like that was a danger in himself, the kind of principal who got his instruments killed, because a desperate man stopped being able to tell the difference between bold and foolish, and dragged everyone tied to him over the same edge. Mortlake had worked for desperate men before and made a rule of it: take the fee in advance, keep the exits clear, and be willing always to walk, because a finder's life was worth more than any finder's fee, and the surest way to lose the first was to grow too fond of the second. He had taken half the fee in advance, the exits were clear. And he sat in the dark of his rented room, in his hair in stillness, and felt the wise move forming in him the way weather forms, the move he had been circling since the empty hat-box and the furnished lie and the watching dark behind a child's wall. That a thing which had hidden itself for 300 years by destroying everyone who reached for it was, perhaps, a thing no finder should reach for either, and that the smartest play left on the board for a man with no wants might be to take his half-fee in his life and his 30-year record of survival, and lose this one on purpose and walk south to the coast and never think of a grey town in Surrey or the remade child in it again. He did not decide those nights. He was too careful to decide before he had to. But he let the move sit in him ready, the way he kept every exit ready, and when his client came to him at last in the back room of the public house, brushing aside patience, brushing aside caution, announcing that Lucian Halloway would take the silver himself and now, and by whatever means a dying man with nothing to lose would use, Mortlake listened and weighed, and felt the ready move stir, and understood that the old fool was about to do the one thing that would make the finder's wisest play not merely wise but obvious. Let the client go to the child, let the desperate reach for the thing that destroyed those who reached, and watch from a safe and patient distance to learn at last whether the relic was worth a fee, or whether, as a cold finder had begun to suspect, it was only worth a man's life, and never the having, and best of all left exactly where 300 years of clever hunters had failed to take it. Lucian Halloway came to Little Winging on a gray afternoon at the end of that week, and the town did not notice the arrival of the most dangerous thing that had ever walked its streets, because the most dangerous things rarely announce themselves, and a dying man in a good coat looks like nothing at all. He had left the cold house full of clocks behind him, the 90 running and the 7 stopped, and he carried the time now in a watch in his waistcoat and in notes folded in his breast pocket, instructions to himself in a hand that shook, the scaffolding a collapsing mind builds to hold itself upright a little longer. The child has it, the finder is called Mortlake, you are looking for a diadem, take it before there is no one left to wear it. He read the notes when the rooms in him went dark, and they lit the rooms again briefly enough to go on, and he went on south to the town where his finder had run the thing to ground, because he no longer trusted the finder's patient weak. The curse had taken something new on the journey down a whole decade, he thought, though he could not now be sure, could not find the decade to check whether it was missing, and the loss had hardened the last clear, ruthless thing in him into a single edge. He would not die a fool with his cure in another man's pocket. He would take it himself now, while there was still a self to take it. He met Mortlake in the dim back room of the public house where the finder had taken a room, and the meeting did not go as Mortlake wished, because the finder had come to counsel patience, and the master had come past the country where patience lived. Mortlake told him in the even voice what he had learned, that the child was no ordinary child, that the relic had remade him, that the boy carried a clemency walls a master would envy, and had emptied a guarded room in the dark the very night a hunter arrived, that this was not a snatch and go. That a guardian who moved first and thought like that had to be approached with great care, studied, drawn out, separated from his defenses before any hand was laid on the prize, and that haste against such a one was how a finder ended up dead with nothing to show. Holloway listened to perhaps half of it before a room in him went dark, and when it lit again he had lost the thread and the patience both, and what he said, leaning across the sticky table with the curse bright and final in his failing eyes, was that he had not crossed England to be told by a hired man to wait. The child was a child. Walls or no walls, the boy was 7 years old and friendless and small, and there were ways to move a small, friendless boy that did not require getting past his mind at all, ways that worked on the body, or on the few soft things a lonely child loved, or simply on the boy's understanding that a grown and ruthless man had found him and would not stop. Holloway had used such ways before, in his long prime. He found, examining himself across the sticky table, that he remembered exactly how, when he could remember so little else. He told the finder he could wait or be paid off as he chose, but that Lucian Holloway would have the silver before the week was out, by whatever means a dying man with nothing to lose was prepared to use, and that the finder would do well to remember which of them was desperate, because a desperate man was a thing even a fearless one should fear. Mortlake looked at the old man across the table, the shaking hands, the empty and filling eyes, the notes in the breast pocket, the ruin of a mind that had once been formidable and was now only dangerous, and the cold still center of him weighed the situation with the detachment he brought to every situation, and did not like the weight. He had been hired to find a thing. He had found it. And now his client, who could no longer reliably remember the finder's name, intended to go and take it personally from a guardian whose defenses had given a 30-year master his first taste of fear in a decade, by methods that would draw every protective eye in the hidden world down on this quiet Surrey town like hawks. It was, Mortlake judged, a plan that would get the old man killed, or worse, exposed, and very possibly take the finder down with him. He had survived 30 years by reading exactly this kind of moment and stepping back from it before it closed. He told Holloway mildly that he would think on the matter overnight, and he went up to his room, and he sat in the dark for a long while in his hair and stillness, weighing his fee against his life, the prize against the price, and beginning, for the first time in a long, profitable, careful career, to consider whether the wisest move left to a finder of lost things might be to lose this one on purpose and walk away, and let a dying fool and a remade child destroy each other over a thing that was, after all, none of his concern. He did not yet know that the remade child had been counting on exactly that. He did not yet know that he had already been read and weighed and built into a plan, the patient instrument and the desperate master both, by a 7-year-old who understood, better than either of them, that the surest way to defeat two enemies is to make certain they arrive at the trap at the same time. Harry went to the dead house before school, in the thin gray light, because the silver had taught him to walk his ground before he fought on it, and because a guardian who trusts a plan he has not tested is a guardian who dies of a surprise. The house at the end of Wisteria Walk had been empty so long that the town had stopped seeing it, a boarded thing behind a jungle of a garden, and Harry let himself in through the gap in the fence he had found in the spring, and went through the wet grass to the back, where one room still held its roof. He stood in the doorway and read the room the way he read everything. A bare floor, sound enough at the center, and rotten along the north wall where the rain had come in for 20 years. He marked the rot, because a man who did not know the floor might put a foot through it, and a man who did would not. One window, grimed to the color of an old penny, facing east, so that tomorrow night the late moon would come through it and lay a single pale rectangle on the boards, and Harry stood where that rectangle would fall, and understood that this was where he would set the silver down in the moonlight, in the middle of the sound floor, in plain sight, within a dying man's reach. The door behind him had a lock long since seized with rust. He crouched and studied it and persuaded it, gently, until it would do what he needed, which was to hold shut when he asked it to and not before. He found the other ways out, the window that would open, the loose board in the north wall behind the rot, the 2 routes a small boy could take that a grown man chasing him could not. He laid them all in his memory beside the floor and the moon and the lock, and when he was done he knew the dead room better than he knew the cupboard he slept in, and the men who would come to it tomorrow night would know it not at all. He did not lay a single working that a watcher could feel. That was the discipline of it, the hardest part. The room had to be, to any eye that swept it, only an empty room, because the protective watchers were near and the finder was nearer, and the smallest thread of magic on the air would unravel everything. So Harry prepared his ground the way the poorest muggle general prepares his, with knowledge and not with power, with the rot and the moon and the lock and the ways out, with nothing anyone could detect and everything he would need. It was, he thought, standing in the cold dead room in the gray morning light, the most important lesson the silver had ever taught him without a word. That the greatest mind in the world wins not by being felt but by being unfelt, not by the size of the magic it throws but by the smallness of the turns it makes, the polished tin tipped, the moth moved 3 inches, the empty room that is a trap because one boy knows the floor and 2 men do not. He felt them as he walked back, the 2 of them, settling into his town like cold fronts. the finder still impatient in his room above the shop, deliberating, the master somewhere near the public house, his dying mind bright and final with want. They had come 400 miles in 19 years and a whole desperate decade to take the thing he carried, and they did not know that they had walked onto ground a 7-year-old had chosen in the spring, against a guardian who had read them both and built a net of their own hungers, with a 1,000-year-old weapon waiting in the moonlight that struck only the kind of men they were. Harry went to school that morning and got the third sum wrong on purpose and gave the gray world its gray nothing, and behind the wall the trap sat ready, and the only thing left to do was to live through the day and wait for the dark and let them come. Holloway did not wait for the finder's overnight thinking. He found the boy himself the next afternoon on the stretch of empty pavement between the school and the turn into Privet Drive, and Harry, who had felt the wrong cold weather of him from 100 yards off, let himself be found, because a guardian who runs is a guardian who teaches the hunter how he runs, and Harry had decided to teach this one nothing true and a great deal false. The old man fell into step beside him, courteous, almost gentle, a tall, stooped gentleman in a good coat with eyes that were not quite right, and he said, "Hello, Harry," in a voice that had once charmed a narrow and dangerous world, and Harry felt the whole of his careful year narrow to a single point, because this was the master, the one behind the finder, the dying furnace of want, and it had come for him in person on an ordinary street with the school still in sight. Harry made himself small and frightened, which was not hard because part of him was, and he kept the wall shut and the front rooms open and his eyes down, and he said nothing, the way a beaten boy says nothing to a strange adult who knows his name. "You have something of mine," Holloway said pleasantly, walking. "A pretty thing, silver. You found it in a box, didn't you, in the library among an old woman's leavings? You needn't pretend. I've come a very long way for it, and I have so little time, and I would so much rather we were friends." And here the pleasantness thinned, and under it Harry felt the thing the dead woman had warned of, the thing that always came, naked for an instant, a hunger so total that it would burn down everything between itself and the silver without a flicker of remorse. "Give it to me, Harry. Tell me where it is, and I will go away, and you will never see me again, and your aunt and your uncle and that kind tired librarian will all go on safe and well. Or don't, and we will find out together how much an old man with nothing left to lose is prepared to do to a small boy and the few soft things he loves. I would rather we were friends, but I have stopped, you understand, being able to afford to care which we are." It was the near thing, the closest Harry's secret ever came to breaking, and it came not from the threat to himself but from the threat to the others, because the old man had named them. The Dursleys he did not love, and the librarian he did, and for one white instant the power rose in Harry the way it had risen all his life. The whole self wished to strike, to fling this cold, dying thing off the edge of the world before it could touch the only person who had ever been kind to him, and the wish was enormous. And it would have worked, and it would have ended everything. The watchers would have felt it, the finder would have known. The dull gray boy would have vanished forever, and in his place would stand, revealed to all the hunting world, exactly the thing Harry had spent a year hiding. A child who could throw a grown wizard the length of a street with a thought. He held it. It was the hardest holding of his life, harder than the alley, harder than the polished tin, harder than letting Mr. Whitby's kindness fall unreceived, to stand small and trembling and apparently helpless while a killer named the people he loved, and to do nothing visible, nothing at all, because the doing would cost more than the threat. He held the power down and folded it small and put it away, and let his face be only a frightened child's face, and let his voice shake, which it did not have to pretend to do, when he said, "It's not at the house. I hid it. I was scared. I hid it somewhere safe." He watched the old man's ruined eyes light, and he gave him in pieces, frightened, reluctant, exactly the false thing he had built to give. That the silver was not at number 4, that the boy in his terror had carried it away and hidden it in an empty house, a derelict place at the end of Wisteria Walk that no one ever went into, that he would take the gentleman there, or tell him the way, only please, please don't hurt anyone, please just take it and go. He made it cost him to say. He made the lie come out the way a true thing comes out of a broken child, in fragments between flinches, and he watched the dying master believe it, because a desperate mind believes what it desperately wants, and what Holloway wanted was a frightened boy who would simply hand over the cure and let him go home to die whole. Harry gave him that boy. He gave him the empty house and the easy victory and the comfortable certainty that the guardian was, after all, only a terrified child, and every word of it was a thread in a net the old man could not see, being woven around him by the very prey he thought he had cornered. "Tomorrow night," Harry whispered, the frightened boy bargaining for time. "I can't get out till they're asleep. Tomorrow night, the house at the end of Wisteria. I'll bring it. Please don't tell the other man, please. I don't want anyone else to know." It was the last thread and the cleverest, "Please don't tell the other man," because Harry knew exactly what it would do. Desperate master, told by his prize to keep a secret from his own hired finder, would do one of two things, and both of them served Harry. He would keep the secret and come alone and arrive at the trap without the one cold professional who might have smelled it, or he would not be able to resist boasting of his victory, his solo triumph over the finder who had counseled patience, and the finder would learn of the meeting and come to, drawn by his own suspicion that the old fool was walking into something. Either way, the ground was Harry's and the time was Harry's, and the only question left was how many of them would be standing on it when the silver did the thing the dead queen had built it to do. Holloway smiled and patted the boy's shoulder with a cold shaking hand, and told him he was being very sensible, and went away down the gray street toward the public house, already composing. Harry could see in the set of him the small, cruel pleasure of his coming triumph. Harry stood on the empty pavement and let himself tremble a moment longer for any watcher, and then he turned for home, and behind the wall in the bright country, the cold, clear part of him closed the last loop of the net and felt it draw tight, and was not glad exactly, because gladness was a thing a face could leak, but was something colder and steadier and entirely his, certain. He set the trap that night, and the setting of it was the finest piece of thinking he had ever done, and he did it alone in the dark, with the silver cool on his brow and the dead woman's warning open in his memory like a hand on his shoulder. Do not throw your life away fighting strength with strength. You will lose. You are a guardian, not a soldier. Let the silver guard itself as it was made to, and stand only where you must. He had read it 100 times, and now he understood it completely, because the rule of the worthy and the unworthy was not a thing that happened on its own. It was a thing that happened when an unworthy mind put the diadem on its own head and demanded what it had no right to receive. The silver would not leap off a shelf and strike a hunter down. It would only do what it had been made to do to the one who wore it by the wearer's own grasping act. So the whole of Harry's task, the entire architecture of the trap, came down to a single elegant necessity. He had to arrange for the unworthy to put it on, not to take it, not to hold it, to wear it willingly, hungrily, reaching with the full grasping weight of their want for the wisdom they had killed and crossed England to seize, and then to let the thing they seized answer them, in the only way it ever answered the unwise. The derelict house at the end of Wisteria Walk was the ground he had chosen, and he had chosen it in the spring, long before he needed it, when he was learning the town the way a general learns a country, because the silver had taught him to prepare the answer before the question was asked. It was a dead house, boarded and forgotten, its garden gone to jungle, a place no living soul went into, with one room at the back that still had a roof and a door that Harry could persuade, and a single window through which the moon came. It was off the protective watcher's beat. He had checked, on the long evenings, walking the boundaries of the wards around Privet Drive until he knew exactly where their hand stopped, and the dead house stood a street beyond the last of it, in the dark between the kind eyes and the cruel ones, where a thing could happen that neither side would feel until it was done. It was his. He knew every floorboard of it, and the hunters knew none, and that, the dead woman had taught him, was worth more than all their strength. He would bring the diadem, that was the part that frightened him, and he made himself look at the fear and use it. He would bring the true silver, the real relic, into a room with 2 men who would kill for it, because the trap could not be sprung with a decoy. The rule answered only the true thing. An unworthy mind that put on a fake would learn nothing and lose nothing, and Harry would have spent his one chance on a bluff the silver could not back. So he would bring the real diadem, and he would set it down between himself and the dying master in the moonlit room within reach, and he would let Holloway's hunger do what hunger did. He would not hand it over. He would let it be taken, which was different, which mattered, because the rule turned on the grasping, on the act of an unworthy mind reaching to seize and command and possess. He had only to make the old man reach and crown himself and demand. The curse and the greed would do the rest, and the wisest making in the world would answer Lucian Holloway exactly as it had answered every grasping mind across 1,000 years, and the sea would not be cruel to the man who could not swim. It would only be the sea. And if the finder came, Harry built that branch of the plan too, because a guardian who plans for one outcome is a guardian who is surprised by the other. If the cold, patient finder came, drawn by suspicion or by the old man's boasting, then Harry would have in one room the desperate master and the wavering instrument both, and a 1,000-year-old weapon that struck only the unworthy, and the dead woman's whole hard wisdom telling him how to use them against each other. A finder who wanted only his fee would not put the silver on his own head. The rule could not touch a man who did not reach for the wisdom, only for the wage. But a finder who watched his desperate employer crown himself and break under the crowning, who watched, with his own cold eyes, the prize he had hunted 19 years destroy the man who paid him. That was a finder who would understand, instantly and completely, that this thing could not be taken, that it had defended itself across 10 centuries precisely because no hunter could hold it, and that the only winning move left to a man with no wants was the one Mortlake had already begun. In the dark of his room, to consider, to lose this one and walk away and live, Harry did not need to defeat the finder. He needed only to show him in the most vivid possible way the truth the finder was already halfway to seeing, and let the finder's own cold sense do the rest. The desperate he would let the silver destroy, the patient he would let the truth dismiss. And the guardian, the small dull boy the whole hunting world had underestimated, would gather up the wisest making in the world from the wreckage of the men who came to steal it, and carry it home through the dark and be, by morning, exactly the nothing he had always seemed, with no one left alive and wanting who knew otherwise. He took the silver off and wrapped it and lay down in the dark, and did not sleep for a long while, not from fear, but because there was one more thing to hold, the heaviest thing, the thing the dead woman had not been able to spare him. That whatever happened tomorrow night in the dead house at the end of Wisteria Walk, a man would very likely die in it, by Harry's design, by Harry's choosing, drowned in the very wisdom he had crossed a country to steal. Harry was 7 years old. He made himself look at that too, all the way to the end, the way the silver had taught him to look at everything. He found that he could bear it. He found that he had decided somewhere in the long lonely year that a guardian who would not bear the cost of guarding was no guardian at all, and that the dead queen had not made her wisest making to be carried by someone unwilling to stand when the time came in a moonlit room and let the unworthy choose their own undoing. He would stand there. He would choose the ground and the terms as she had told him to, and he would let the silver guard itself as it was made to. And then he would go home and be small and be safe and be alone, which was the price which had always been the price and which he had stopped a long cold year ago expecting to ever stop paying. Tomorrow night then, the house at the end of Wisteria. He closed his eyes, and behind the wall the smartest mind in Britain ran the trap through one final time, found it sound, and let him sleep. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The smartest wizard alive. He came to the dead house at the end of Wisteria Walk an hour before midnight, with the wisest making in the world wrapped in a moth-eaten shawl against his belly, and he set it down in the moonlight and sat in the dark to wait, and he was, for the first time in a year, exactly where everyone hunting him wished him to be. The late moon had risen, as he had known it would, and came through the grimed eastern window and lay a single pale rectangle on the soundboards at the center of the room, and Harry knelt at the edge of it and unwound the shawl and set the diadem down in the moonlight, in plain sight, the silver bright and cool and patient as it had been in the hatbox a year ago, the blue stone holding its slow deep current, the cut words running their 1,000-year promise around the inner band. He set it where a reaching hand would find it. Then he withdrew to the dark by the north wall, where the rot was, where he knew the floor and a hunter would not, with one root out through the loosened board at his back and another through the window he had taught to open, and he folded himself down small and still and waited, a small shadow in a dead room with his trap laid in the light. He felt Holloway before he heard him, the wrong cold weather of the dying mind, bright and final, coming up the overgrown path through the wet jungle of the garden, alone, as Harry had built him to come, the desperate master keeping his prize a secret from his own finder for the sake of a triumph he wanted to taste by himself. The seized door, which Harry had persuaded to do exactly one thing, gave under the old man's hand, and Lucian Holloway came into the moonlit room and stopped and saw the silver lying in the light. Harry watched the want take him. It was a terrible thing to watch, and Harry made himself watch all of it, because he had decided a year ago that a guardian who would not bear the cost of guarding was no guardian at all. The old man's ruined face, lit silver from below, went slack with a hunger so total that everything else in him seemed to pour toward it and drain away. The courtesy, the cunning, the last brittle dignity, all of it gone in an instant, leaving only the naked starving thing that had crossed a country to feed. There you are, Holloway breathed to the silver, not to the boy. There you are. He had forgotten Harry entirely. Frightened child who had let him hear the bargain, the threat to the soft things the boy loved, all of it fallen through one of the dark doors in his collapsing mind, leaving only the prize in the moonlight and the want. It's yours, Harry said from the dark in the small, flat, broken voice of a child surrendering. I brought it like I said, take it and go, please just take it and go. But the old man did not move at once, and in the held instant before he did, Harry felt the night come to its knife edge. Because something surfaced in Lucian Holloway, there in the moonlight, with the prize a hand's reach away, some last cold sliver of the formidable mind he had been before the curse began to close the doors, a relic of the man whose name the narrow world had spoken in a hush. He stopped with his ruined eyes on the silver, and a different expression crossed his lit face, and Harry read it the way he read everything, instantly and completely, and did not like it, suspicion. The old cunning surfacing through the hunger like a rock through a flood. Why, said Holloway slowly, and turned his head and looked for the first time since he had entered directly at the small shadow by the north wall. Why would you give it up, a thing like this? You found it, you hid it, you led me a chase a grown wizard would have been proud of, and now you simply lay it in the moonlight and tell me to take it and go. The shaking hand had stopped reaching. The dying mind, for one terrible flickering moment, had remembered how to be afraid of a thing that was too easy. What is it, he breathed, that you know about this, that I do not? It was the near break of the whole night, far closer than the threat on the pavement, because the trap turned entirely on the old man crowning himself, and a Halloway who suspected the crown would not put it on would turn instead on the boy, would demand and threaten and perhaps simply kill, and take the silver away cold in his pocket to study at his leisure, and Harry's one weapon, the rule that struck only the reaching hand, would never come into play at all. Harry felt the whole architecture of the year balance on the next thing he said, and he did the hardest thing the silver had ever taught him, which was to lie by telling the truth, and to do it through a frightened child's face while the cold, clear mind behind it worked at the speed of falling. "Because it doesn't work for me," Harry said, and let his voice crack and let the tears come, which was not hard because some of them were real. "I put it on. That's how I knew it was special. That's the only reason I took it. I put it on in my cupboard and it didn't do anything. It just sat there cold. It's not for children. It's not for whatever I am. I read about it in the old lady's books, the ones in the funny writing, and they said it only works for a great wizard, a proper one, a clever grown-up one, and I'm none of those things. I'm nobody. I'm just a boy who found a pretty thing in a box and got scared when a man came looking." Let the misery pour, the whole convincing flood of a frightened child desperate to be rid of a danger, and under it behind the wall he watched the old man drink it down because it was nearly true, every word of it nearly true, the truth with one boy removed. The diadem did only work for the worthy. The books had said exactly that, and a great clever grown-up wizard was precisely what Lucian Halloway, in the ruin of his pride, still believed himself to be. "Please just take it," Harry wept. "It's wasted on me. It's wasted in a box under my stairs. You're a great wizard. Anyone can see it. You crossed the whole country. You found me when no one finds me. It'll work for you. It was always going to work for someone like you. I just want it gone. I just want all of you to go away and leave me alone." He watched the words do their work, and the work was beautiful and terrible to watch. The suspicion in the old man's face did not vanish so much as drowned by the very thing Harry had fed it, the flattery that was the truth, the assurance that the silver was wasted on a child and made for a great wizard, pouring straight into the deepest hunger of a dying mind that wanted, above all things on earth, to be told that it was still great, still worthy, still the formidable man it had been before the doors began to close. The cunning sank back beneath the flood. The fear of a thing too easy gave way to the fear that had ruled him for a decade, the fear of the dark coming in, the curse closing the last room, the cure lying right there in the moonlight while precious seconds bled away into a child's sniveling. And Lucian Halloway, told by his trembling prize that the wisdom was his by right, that it had only ever been waiting for a wizard great enough to receive it, made the choice that every grasping mind across 1,000 years had made before him, and stopped being afraid of how easy it was because he wanted, more than he wanted to be careful, to believe that it was easy because he deserved it. "Yes," he said to himself, to the silver, the suspicion gone, the want returned tenfold. "Yes, of course. Of course it is," and the reaching began again. He did not need to say it. The old man was already moving, drawn across the room to the light the way iron is drawn to a lodestone, and Harry held very still in the dark and did the one thing the whole architecture of the trap required, which was nothing, no working, no word, no turn of the world a watcher could feel, only a boy crouched in the shadows, letting a grasping mind walk to its own undoing. Halloway knelt in the moonlight before the silver as a man kneels at an altar, and his shaking hands came down and lifted it, and Harry saw the want crest in him, the certainty, the end of the long terror, the cure in his own two hands at last. And Lucian Halloway, who had crossed England to seize the wisdom he had killed for, raised the diadem of Rowan or Ravenclaw and set it on his own head and demanded what it held. He learned, perhaps in the last clear instant before the end, exactly what the dead woman's notebook had warned across 1,000 years, that the vessel of wisdom could not be commanded by the unwise, and that the sea is not cruel to the man who cannot swim. For one heartbeat nothing happened, the same hanging instant Harry had known in the cupboard a year ago, the silver resting cold against an unworthy brow. And then the room filled with a light that was not the moon's, a deep blue rising from the stone, and Halloway's face, lifted and triumphant in the moment of his victory, changed. Harry made himself watch. Old man had reached, with the full grasping weight of a dying greed, for the wit beyond measure, and the wit beyond measure came, all of it, the accumulated understanding of the wisest mind the world had made. The whole vast clear room that had opened so gently for a curious child pouring itself instead into a mind that had come to seize and command and possess, a mind with no humility to receive it and no patience to hold it and no love of the climbing, only the hunger for the height. It poured in. And there was nowhere in Lucian Halloway for it to go. He did not scream, or not for long. What happened to his face was worse than screaming, and Harry would carry it in his perfect memory all his life, and would decide holding it that he had been right to make himself watch. The triumph emptied out of the old man's eyes, and something vast and bewildered came in, a man drowning in a depth past all measuring, the understanding of 10 centuries breaking over a mind that had room for none of it, washing through the locked and failing house of him, and tearing every door from every hinge at once. The curse had emptied him slowly, room by room, over years. The diadem emptied him in a moment and filled the emptiness with an ocean, and the ocean did to Lucian Halloway exactly what an ocean does to lungs that try to breathe it. His hands fell from the silver. The deep blue light sank back into the stone. And the thing that knelt in the moonlight where a dangerous dying man had knelt a moment before was no longer anyone at all, a body still breathing, eyes open and bottomlessly empty. The mind that had been Lucian Halloway poured out and drowned and gone, leaving a hollow that would breathe and stare and never again know its own name, or want anything, or be afraid. The want was over. It was the only mercy in it, and it was not a small one, and Harry, kneeling in the dark, made himself hold that too, that the dying man had wanted, above all things, to stop being afraid, and that he had, at the last, by his own grasping hand, received it. The diadem slid from the empty head and rang once on the boards, bright and unharmed, 1,000 years old and 1,000 years patient, and lay in the moonlight exactly as it had lain before, having done only what it was made to do, to the one who chose to make it. "I have been 30 years in my trade," said a mild voice from the doorway, "and I have never seen anything do that." Harry did not start because he had felt the finder come up the path 5 minutes before, drawn exactly as the plan had drawn him, by suspicion and by the old man's poorly kept secret, to watch from the dark of the doorway the thing he had hunted 19 years destroy the man who had paid him to find it. Mortlake stood in the broken doorway, gray and still, his eyes on the empty husk in the moonlight and the bright silver beside it, and his face did not change because his face had been trained out of changing a long time ago, but the cold still center of him had gone very quiet, the quiet of a man recalculating his entire understanding of a situation, fast and to the bottom. "It only ever does that," Harry said from the dark by the north wall, and he let his voice be his own now, for the first time in front of any living person, not the frightened child's and not the dull boy's, only Harry's, quiet and level and 7 years old and entirely unafraid. "To anyone who reaches for it like that, it can't be taken. It was made so it couldn't be taken. 300 years of people died learning that, and the line that guarded it spread the story that it was lost, so the rest of you would stop reaching." He let the finder look at him in the dark, the small shape that had emptied a guarded room in the night and built a still life of a wretched mind to fool a master, and laid a net of 2 men's hungers in a dead house and chosen the ground in the spring. "You already knew it couldn't be taken. You felt it when you tried my mind on the pavement and met a wall you couldn't pass. You've been thinking ever since that the wise move was to lose this one and walk away. You were right. I arranged tonight so that you get to watch why you were right, because I'd rather you walked away understanding than walked away wondering. A man who wonders comes back." Mortlake was silent a long moment in the moonlit doorway, with the husk of his employer breathing slow and empty between them. He looked at the silver, the prize, lying bright and unguarded 6 feet away, and Harry watched him weigh it one final time, 30 years of habit against one night of evidence, and watched the cold sense win as Harry had built it to win, because a finder who wanted only his fee in his life would not put that thing on his own head now if the whole of the world were watching, having seen what it had just made of a stronger and hungrier man. "No," Mortlake said at last, mildly, almost to himself. "No, I don't believe I'll be reaching for it." He looked at the small shadow by the north wall, and something moved behind his still gray face that might in a warmer man have been respect. "You're a great deal more than the boy I was hired to take it from." "I'm a great deal more than anyone thinks," Harry agreed, without pride, only stating it, the way he had stated it once to himself in the dark, the way he would never again be able to say it to anyone alive, "and I'd like it to stay that way. You can have something for your trouble, since the man who hired you won't be paying. You can have your life and the truth that the diadem is lost, destroyed, gone, the way the story always said, and that the old fool who hired you chased a myth and died of it, mad, the way men do who chase myths. Tell whoever asks, it's even nearly true. There's nothing here worth a finder's time, and there never will be again, and the smartest thing a man with no wants ever did was to want, just this once, to be somewhere else. He let the offer sit in the dark, or you can reach for it, it's right there, I won't stop you." It was the last test, and they both knew it, and Mortlake looked at the bright silver in the moonlight, 6 feet away, unguarded, his for the taking, and then he looked at the empty thing that had been Lucian Halloway, breathing and staring and gone, and he did the thing 30 careful years had taught him, which was to step back from a door before it closed on him. "I think," said the finder, "that I was never here." He inclined his head to the small shadow in the dark, a professional acknowledging, across the wreckage of a contract, the better operator in the room. And Mortlake turned and went out through the broken door, gray and still and unhurried, down the overgrown path and out of the dead garden and out of the town and out of the story. A man who had hunted a thing for 19 years and walked away from it at arm's length because a 7-year-old had shown him, precisely and only once, exactly why he should. He was the patient one Harry had understood. You did not destroy, you dismissed. When the finder's steps had faded down the path and out of hearing, Harry came out of the dark by the north wall and crossed the moonlit room and knelt by the silver, and for a while he did not pick it up. He knelt instead beside the hollow thing that had been Lucian Halloway, breathing slow and even in the moonlight, its eyes open on nothing, and he made himself look at it, all of it, the whole cost of the night laid out on the rotten boards. He had done this. Not the silver, not the rule, not 1,000-year-old law he had only borrowed. He had built the net and chosen the ground and led a dying man by his own hunger to the place where the hunger would drown him. And a person who had been alive an hour ago, dangerous and cruel and frightened, was now an empty house with the lights left on, and Harry Potter, 7 years old, had arranged it. He did not look away from that, and he did not pretend it was clean, and he did not let the cold, clear part of him talk him out of the weight of it, because a guardian who felt nothing was a guardian one short step from the men he guarded against. He let it be heavy. He knelt in the moonlight and let a man's ruin be exactly as heavy as it was, and he understood, kneeling there, that this was the last and hardest thing the silver had taught him without a word, that the price of being the one who could end a danger was being the one who had to carry having ended it alone forever, with no one to tell and no one to share it and no absolution anywhere but the cold certainty that the alternative had been worse. Halloway would have killed him. Would have killed Miss Pelham and burned down everything between himself and the silver, and taken the wisest making in the world to feed a greed that the grave was already closing on. Harry had weighed a guilty boy against a dead librarian and a stolen relic and a hunter who never stopped, and he had chosen, and he would carry the choosing, and he found, kneeling in the moonlight at 7 years old, that he could. That was the terrible discovery at the bottom of the night, not that he had won. That he could bear what winning cost and would, and that there was no longer any version of himself that got to be a child who could not. Then he picked up the diadem and wrapped it in the shawl and put it against his belly where it had ridden all year, and turned his cold, clear mind to the last work of the night, which was to make certain that no thread of any of it ever led back to a small boy under the stairs at number 4. He thought it through the way he thought through everything completely to the end, standing in the dead room with the husk breathing behind him. The watchers would find this. That was the fixed point he built around the protective eyes that warded Privet Drive and watched from among the cats would, sooner or later, feel the residue of the great working that had emptied a man in this room and come and find what was here. He could not prevent their finding. So he would shape what they found, the way the dead woman's line had shaped what the world believed for 1,000 years. He would let the scene tell a true story that left him out of it, and the true story was very nearly the whole truth, which was the beauty of it. A wizard would be found, an old man, identifiable to anyone who knew the narrow world's hushed names as Lucian Halloway, a figure long associated with the darker edges of that world, vanished from his own cold house full of clocks. He would be found mad, emptied, his mind gone, in a way the healers would eventually trace, if they were clever, to a curse he had carried for years into some final catastrophic reaching beyond his strength. He would be found in a derelict muggle house far from home, having plainly come south chasing something, the way the obsessed and the dying do, and having found, at the end of it, only the ruin he had been racing all along. There would be no relic, because the relic was a myth, lost 3 centuries gone. The watchers would shake their heads over a broken old man's mad pilgrimage after a thing that did not exist, and file it among the sad ends of dangerous men, and never once think to connect it to the small warded boy 3 streets away who had nothing to do with the narrow world at all. The story told itself. Harry had only to add nothing to it, leave nothing of himself in it, and let the watcher's own reasonable assumptions do the rest, exactly as he had let Mr. Whitby's assumptions and the finder's assumptions and the whole grey world's assumptions do his hiding for him all year. The cleverest lie was the truth with one boy removed from it, so he removed the boy. He had touched nothing here that would hold him. He had laid no working the night would remember as his. The husk had never known the child who led it here, that knowledge having drained through one of the dark doors of its dissolving mind hours before the end. The dead house had been chosen in the spring precisely because it stood a street beyond the last of the wards, in the dark between the kind eyes and the cruel ones, where the working's residue would read as Halloway's and Halloway's alone. The librarian was already protected, her memory of the boy gone soft and gray, the worthless box of a dead woman's leavings already gone to the tip. The finder was gone and would, Harry judged, keep his bargain, because a man with no wants who has just watched a thing destroy its taker has every reason in the world to want never to think of it again. There was no thread. Harry stood in the dead room and ran the whole of it through one final time, every loose end, every eye, every assumption, and found it sound, and found himself, at the end of the running, holding a thing he had never held before in all his hunted year, nothing left to do. He slipped out through the loosened board in the north wall, the way a grown man chasing him could not have followed, and left the dead house to the moon and the husk and the watchers who would come, and went home through the sleeping town with the wisest making in the world safe against his skin, and behind him the trap he had built closed quietly over the last of his enemies and left no sign at all that a child had set it. The walk home was the longest of his life, and the quietest, and somewhere in the middle of it Harry stopped being hunted, and felt the year go out of him like a held breath at last released. He took the gardens and the alleys and the fence gaps he had learned in the spring, soft and small under the orange lamps, and the protective watcher in the cat stirred once and read a wretched boy wandering and lost interest, and Harry let it, gave it its grey nothing one more time, the last time it would ever matter so much. He was very tired. The tiredness was new. He had not let himself feel it in a year, the simple animal exhaustion of a small body that had carried too much for too long, and he felt it now walking because there was finally room. The thing was done. The hunt that the dead woman had promised across 1,000 years, the coming she had warned was already begun, had come and broken on the ground he chose, and he had survived it, and the silver was his, and no one living and wanting knew otherwise. He let himself feel walking the enormous quiet of that, and under the quiet, threaded through it, the heavier things he would carry now forever, the husk in the moonlight, the cost, the cold certainty that he could bear it, and he found that the quiet and the weight could live in him together, the way the wonder and the loneliness had learned to, the way so many things had learned to share the bright country behind his wall. He was not, he understood, the boy who had lifted a band of silver to his brow in a cupboard a year ago. That boy had been hungry to understand. This boy understood and had paid for the understanding, and had found at the bottom of the paying not the simple gladness the hungry boy had imagined, but something better and colder and more durable, the deep settled steadiness of a person who has met the worst the world could send at him and chosen the ground and stood. He was 7 years old. He walked home through the dark, a small, unremarkable shadow, and he was the most dangerous thing in the county, and the only person who would ever know it was him. He let himself in through the cupboard latch that opened for him, and folded himself into the dark under the stairs, and put the diadem back behind the loose board in the dry, dusty dark where it had ridden out the year, and lay down on the thin cot in the warded silence, and for a while he simply lay there in the place that had been a prison and was now, he understood, only a hiding place, which was a different thing, which he had made a different thing. The cupboard had not changed, he had. He had walked into it a year ago, a boy to whom strange things happened, helpless, blamed, unwanted, and he would walk out of it in the morning a boy who got the third sum wrong on purpose. And between those two boys lay the whole secret country no one would ever see, the light he could make, the wall he had built, the hunters he had broken, the dead queen's wisdom waiting cool behind a board for the long unwatched hours of his own small life. He had everything he had wanted in the cupboard a year ago. He had it secret and safe and his, and the having of it had cost him exactly what the dead woman had promised it would cost, which was everything and was worth it, both at once, forever. He closed his eyes. For the first time in a year there was nothing in the dark that he had to plan for, and the smartest mind in Britain, having nothing left to do, let its small, tired body sleep. The aftermath unfolded over the days that followed exactly as Harry had built it to unfold, and the watching of it was the final lesson of his hunted year, the proof that a thing well planned needs no tending once it is set in motion. He felt the watchers find the dead house on the second morning. He was at the breakfast table, getting his portion of nothing in particular and being nothing in particular, when the protective attention woven into the air of Privet Drive sharpened and shifted and turned, all at once, toward the far end of Wisteria Walk, a quickening among the cats, a stir in the wards, the sense of careful unseen people arriving in a hurry at a place where something had been felt. Harry ate his toast and gave the table its grey nothing and listened, behind the wall, to his trap close its last loop without him. The narrow world had come for its own. They would find Lucian Halloway breathing and empty in a derelict muggle house, and they would find the residue of a great and catastrophic working that read, to any eye that swept it, as the man's own final reckless reaching, and they would find no relic, because the relic was a myth 3 centuries lost, and they would find no child, because the child was 3 streets away eating toast and had never, by any thread anyone could pull, been there at all. He let himself follow it lightly over the days, the way the story moved through the layers of the world. There would have been muggle police first, called by a neighbor to a broken old man wandering and witless, and then very quickly the quiet people of the narrow world arriving to take the matter gently out of muggle hands, a memory adjusted here, a report misfiled there, the soft machinery by which the hidden world swallowed its own catastrophes and left the ordinary one undisturbed. And at the bottom of all of it, the conclusion Harry had written for them before any of them knew there was a story to conclude. A dangerous old man of the dark associations, long curse-eaten, had gone mad chasing a lost legend and burned out the last of his mind in the chasing. A sad end, a cautionary one. The narrow world would shake its head over Lucian Halloway and file him among the obsessed and the undone, and not one of them, from the careful people in the dead house to the old man with the silver beard far to the north, would ever think to look past the small warded boy on Privet Drive, the safe boy, the untouched boy, the boy so perfectly and unremarkably uninvolved that his very distance from the strange event 3 streets away was itself the surest proof he had nothing to do with it. The cleverest place to stand, Harry had learned, was always just outside the edge of the thing you had done, wearing the blank face of a person to whom nothing ever happened. He went past the library once that week on the far pavement, not stopping, a dull boy with somewhere else to be. Through the glass he could see Miss Pelham at her desk, the ink stain bright on her cuff, cataloging in the warm yellow light, safe and ordinary, and entirely unaware that a cold hand had reached into her for a child's name, and that a smaller hand had reached in after it to fog the bruise away. She did not look up. He had told her he was moving. She believed the queer solemn boy was gone, and she would think of him now, and then with the mild fondness one keeps for a child who passed through and out of one's life, and she would never know that the passing had saved her, that the small lie at the door had been the last and kindest thing he ever did for the only person in his daylight world who had been kind to him first. Harry walked on and did not look back through the glass, because looking was an answer and he gave the watching world none, and because some kindnesses he had learned you could only perform by walking away from them and never letting them know they had been performed at all. He added Miss Pelham, safe at her desk in the yellow light, to the bright country behind the wall, where he kept all the things he could not have and would not risk, and he carried her there, warm, the rest of his life. And then there was nothing more to watch, and the year was over, and Harry Potter went back to being 7. Far to the north, in a circular office full of softly whirring silver instruments, an old man with a long silver beard paused in the middle of a sentence and looked up and frowned. He could not have said what he had felt. It was the faintest of things, a tremor at the very edge of the wards he had woven, years ago, around a house in Surrey and the child who lived there. Not a breach, nothing so clear as a breach, only a ripple, a sense that somewhere out near the boundary of his long patient watching, something had happened and ended and gone quiet again before he could turn his attention to it. He sat for a while with the feeling in the whirring dark of his office, and turned over what little had reached him. There were reports that week that would later seem to bear on it. A man of the old dark associations, a collector named Halloway, found wandering and mad in a derelict house in the very county where the boy lived, his mind burned hollow by some final reckless reaching after a power he had spent his ruined years chasing. A sad end, a dangerous man undone by his own hungers, the way such men so often were. The old man read the report when it came, and thought of the ripple at the edge of his wards, and felt the faint cold touch of a question he could not quite shape, that it was strange, was it not, for such a thing to happen so near the child, and for the child to be so entirely untouched by it, so exactly and unremarkably safe. But the child was safe. That was the thing that mattered, the thing the old man had given so much of his long care to ensuring, and the wards reported the boy precisely as they always reported him. An ordinary, unremarkable, unhappy little boy, neglected by his muggle relations, magical of course, the way the boy was bound to be magical, but showing nothing yet, no sign of the storm that would one day come for him, only the small gray life of a child waiting to grow. The old man looked at that report and at the other and felt the question hover and let it go, because there was no thread to pull and 1,000 other cares pressing, and because it did not occur to him, it could not have occurred to him, it would not occur to him for years, that the small gray unremarkable boy and the silence at the edge of his wards might be the same fact seen from two sides. He had set himself to protect a child from the world. It had not entered his wisest imaginings that the child might already, quietly in a cupboard under the stairs, have begun to protect the world from itself, or that the safest-seeming boy in Britain was safe because he had made himself so, against enemies the old man would never learn had come, with a thing the old man believed had been lost 300 years. He turned back to his work, the old man, and let the small frown smooth away, and resolved only to keep watching as he had always watched over the boy who would one day matter so much. And he did keep watching in the years that followed, faithfully, kindly, from a distance, and he saw, year upon year, exactly what Harry Potter let him see, which was nothing, which was a quiet child of no particular distinction growing up neglected and ordinary in a quiet street, until the morning the letter came. It would come, Harry knew, on his 11th birthday, the way the rain came to every child like him. He had read it in the dead woman's books and worked it out for himself in the long cold nights, a letter in green ink on the last day of his 10th year, opening a door in his hidden life whether he willed it or not. He had 3 years yet. 3 years to go on being the dull gray boy the world had agreed to ignore, 3 years to deepen the bright country behind the wall, to read what no living wizard had read and master what no living wizard could master, alone in the dark, with the wisest making in the world cool against his brow. And then the door would open, and he would walk through it into a castle full of people who could read minds and lay wards and wield the very power he had spent his childhood hiding, and he would have to decide before then exactly who the boy who walked through that door was going to be. He had already decided. He decided it that night, lying in the dark with the year gone out of him and the silver safe behind the board, and the deciding had the same cold steadiness as everything he chose now. He would walk through that door exactly as he had walked through every door of his hunted year, as the smallest, dullest, most overlookable thing in the room, giving the watching world its gray nothing, hiding in the one place no one ever thought to look, which was in plain sight beneath everyone's notice, behind a face that promised nothing at all. They would see a thin boy with broken glasses and a famous scar, an orphan, a story, a thing their world had a use for. They would not see the guardian. They would not see the mind a dead queen had crossed 1,000 years to find and crown. They would not see until he chose to let them, and he did not think he would choose to let them for a very long time, the smartest wizard alive, who had found the wisest thing in the world at the age of 7 in a hat box hiding from his cousin, and had kept it and would keep it in the dark, where all the truest treasures had to be kept. Outside the cupboard, the house at number 4 slept on and knew nothing, as it always had. Inside it, behind a loose board 8 inches from a sleeping boy's head, the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw rested cool and bright and patient, guarded at last by the worthiest mind it had met in 1,000 years, and waited, as it had always waited, for the next thing worth understanding. It would not have to wait long. Harry Potter was 7 years old, and he was only just beginning, and the world had no idea at all. Chapter 7 End.